Snow still clung to the shaded sides of Winterfell's walls where the sun, thin as a knife, had not yet undone the night's work. The stones sweated steam from the hot springs below, veils of warmth that drifted along the battlements and curled past arrow slits like breath. Beneath it all, the keep held the patient smells that never changed. The clean iron of the smithy, the animal musk of the stables, the faint green damp of the godswood. Crows blinked from the rookery's ledge, black beads set in the morning. They watched the yard where boys made men's sounds with blunted steel. Eddard Stark moved through the godswood with steps that remembered the path without looking. The moss accepted him. The whisper of the leaves was not a whisper, but a low rasp, like old cloth between calloused fingers. He stopped before the heart tree and stood close enough to see the smoothness of tears carved ages ago down the trunk, pink as if the eyes had wept fresh blood. He did not speak to it. He listened as his father had. The air in the godswood changed when one respected it. Men from the south did not understand that. They filled silences with plans until they drowned in them. Footfalls disturbed the outer path. Ned did not turn. He knew the sound of Jon's step as the boy came to the edge of the clearing and stopped, unwilling to bring bastardy any closer to a holy place than it already lived inside him. Ned found a small, humorless smile in the habit. "You were light on your feet this morning." "I tried to be, my lord," Jon said. He kept his eyes low, but he had not come to bow. "Robb says the first horns will sound by midday. The king is near." "So they say." Ned let out a breath he had not known he was holding, and the old words from an old time tumbled in his mind, though he gave them no voice. There was no good lodging for dread within him, but it had entered anyway and taken a bed. He will want to hunt before he eats. He will want to drink before he speaks. And he will want to speak before he listens. Jon's smile was quick, almost guilty. "They say the queen rides with him. They say many things." Ned's eyes lifted to the red leaves and the pale face in their cradle. "Go on. Train with your brother. See that Theon does not break another spear." When Jon had gone, Ned stayed long enough for the trees to reclaim the soundscape. He could hear a drop of water find a fall and the soft buzz of a fly that had woken early. He let memory touch him lightly and move along. Then he left the godswood because kings did not keep their own time. They kept everyone's. In the yard, Robb and Jon stood masked by sweat and sawdust. Theon Greyjoy circled them like a fox who had discovered he preferred the hound's company to the hens. Bran clung to a crenel far above with no fear of the space under him. Arya had a stick that she named a sword and a scowl that she named a lesson. Sansa watched from the steps with Septa Mordane and a small smile she thought she hid. Lady lay against Sansa's skirts, half asleep, ears following more than eyes. Nymeria paced and paced again, never content to lie when there was something to measure. "Arms straight," Ser Rodrik called, his whiskers wet with mourning. "Straight. Jon, keep your foot where your foot belongs." Jon adjusted. He had a talent for doing as he was told even when the order cut his pride. Robb, taller now, had begun to look like a man even when he laughed like a boy. When he lowered his play shield, he took a full breath. When he raised it, he held half a breath. Such small economies made a soldier. He grinned at Jon and knocked the blunted sword aside and took a pad of leather to the shoulder for his trouble. Theon applauded anyway, as if he had ordered the exchange and both had obeyed. "Enough," Ned said, and the yard's noise found a new level. "The horns will sound soon. Ser Rodrik, see that we look like we know our own house." "Aye, my lord." Roderick's hand went to his whiskers, to gather and release, a habit like prayer. Catelyn found Ned before the first horn. She had prayed in the little sept, where candles hued the air to their own clean geometry, and she wore the gravity that prayer leaves on a face. She took his hand as if she would steady him or herself, and their fingers recognized one another and rested. "Maester Luwin says the Lord Steward set 30 tables in the Great Hall. We have casks enough. Bread is still in the ovens. The kitchens are peaceable, as kitchens never are." "And the children?" "Wound too tight," she said, but she meant she loved them. "It will be a bright thing for Sansa." She may never forgive the world if Joffrey is unhandsome. Ned's mouth made something that was not quite a smile. We cannot hang the prince if he disappoints her. No, Catelyn said, and looked past Ned's shoulder to the sky above the wall with its cool, untroubled blue. But we can teach discipline to the heart. She hesitated. You knew he would come. You always knew. I knew, Ned said. And in that word were all the years between a green war and this gray day. He had known it when he buried his father and his brother. He had known it under another sky with the smell of ash in it. He had known it each time another raven took wing and none returned with news of a different king. The horns rounded Winterfell's towers and came to rest in every man's chest. The first was low and long. The second was brighter. The third was short, like a notch made with a small knife. Folk who had never seen a crowned head came to the yard with their mouths open as if the sound itself had commanded them. Children found higher vantage and were told to come down and did not. The yard learned its lines in a hurry and then forgot them again as horses, sweating and proud, carried the south inside the north. Robert Baratheon made the gates look narrow only because everything around him shrank to make room for the thing he carried that was not a crown and was not a battle hammer yet was both. He wore the years like jerkin leather gone soft with use and wine, and he sat his horse well because his body remembered doing it when it mattered. Cersei Lannister rode on a palfrey that knew precisely how to look as if she were not riding it. She had hair that collected the sunlight and gave it back grudgingly, and eyes like a calculation arriving at its answer. The prince rode a step behind, and his youth could not save his face from the way it held itself too high. He had the king's color and the queen's edge. Ned went to one knee because some things must be done properly and in sight of everyone. Robert dismounted with the groan of leather and a man's own greeting to the bones he cannot persuade. He reached Ned before protocol could and pulled him up and squeezed him until Ned felt the old ribs remember they had kept worse company. 7 hells, Ned. You've gone hard in the face. I've gone soft in the belly. Between us, we might make one tolerable lord. You'd never manage, Ned said, and the words were simple and clean and older than their gray hairs. They spoke as men speak who have shared winter nights with nothing but a fire and a promise not to die yet. Cersei inclined her head at the right angle to look like honor was not difficult. Her smile was the sort that asked whether anyone else believed in smiles. When she took Ned's hand, it was warm. When she let it go, there was a sense of something returned to where it lived, all edges and question marks. Your Grace, Catelyn said, and curtsied with the grace of a woman who had measured grace and found it both useful and insufficient. The queen appraised her with a care that said she did not waste care on anyone unworthy of fear or contempt. The line between those is thin. Joffrey gave Sansa a court bow that had the right number of degrees and none of the right heart. He had learned the numbers and forgotten the meaning. Sansa curtsied back and felt the room of her chest grow large with a story she had told herself in lamplight, with Septa Mordane's cool hand correcting the windings of her hair and her words. Joffrey's mouth had the suggestion of sweetness and the certainty of scorn, as if he had tasted a summer peach and then ordered the tree burned for daring. Lady pressed into Sansa's calf to remind her of warmer truths. Nymeria paced, and Arya gripped her stick as if she liked the feel of splinters. Formalities completed, Robert demanded Winterfell's crypts because grief holds its own hunger, and a king is a man under the same moon. They went down with torches that made the stone give back colors it did not own. The dead had their iron swords across their stone knees and their stone faces, and the king stood a long time before the girl who had torn out a piece of his life and carried it with her beneath the earth. Ned waited with him and did not pretend that words would be companion enough. When Robert spoke, the sound touched nothing but the man it came from. In the great hall that night, the north met the south and discovered that both were loud. Fat geese met fat laughter, and beef met beards, and ale remembered why it was brewed. Minstrels scraped and fluted, and the old hunters beat time with heel and knuckle. The king did not sit so much as anchor the king's chair. He drank like an oath he had raised too many times to count and refused to be outdone by his younger self. Cersei took small sips and larger measures of every man's face. Tyrion Lannister, who had the look of a man who had watched the world from its underside until the shape of it made a private kind of sense, disappeared by degrees under the table and returned with a flagon and a fresh remark, neither of which seemed inevitable until they existed. Sansa's cheeks warmed under the hearth's breathing and the prince's gaze. He had a way of looking that made everything in the room belong to him for the length of that look. She wanted to belong in that way. Songs made that desire sound like honor. She did not catch how the small muscles at the corners of his eyes pinched when he disliked a note. She told herself he disliked nothing. He was the prince. Septa Mordane's smile was as firm as a lace knot. Lady's nose touched Sansa's wrist once, cool as water. Arya stuffed half a pigeon pie into her mouth and listened to 3 conversations at once. She watched the hound, whose face was a lesson in fire's indifference, stand behind the prince like a shadow that had not asked to attach itself to anything so foolish. She liked him because he did not pretend to be handsome, and because he looked at people as if he had decided already what they were good for and had found most of them useless. She liked him less when he looked at the dire wolves with the patience of a man measuring risk. The night lengthened until it felt used. Robert, full of meat and victory that had happened a long time ago, stood with a wobble and thumped his cup so that the table considered breaking. "Winterfell," he boomed. "Here's my friend. Here's my north. Here's enough meat to shame the 7. He laughed at his own excess without shame. Then his eyes sharpened, a surprising quickness, and he raised his voice so the highest beam could hear. "And here are 2 houses that ought to remember they stood shoulder to shoulder when it mattered. Stark and Baratheon. Wolf and stag. We'll make it true again." Ned felt a small cold place wake in his chest with the surety of an animal who had been waiting all day in a burrow. He saw the queen's head turn before the words fully arrived. He saw Catelyn's hand touch the table edge, lightly. Sansa's knuckles whitened on Lady's fur. Robert spread his arms as if he would embrace the hall. "We'll do more than talk. We'll bind the knot. I have a son. You have a daughter." He thrust his cup toward Joffrey without turning and splashed wine onto silk and gold. "Why do we wait to do the thing that should have been done when they were born? Lord Stark, I want your Sansa for my Joffrey, and I am tired of wanting things as if I were a boy. We will make it so. We will make it now." It was a blow delivered with laughter. Laughter doesn't soften blows. It disguises them. The hall's cheer rose on instinct, on the habit of taking its cues from loudness. The queen's smile arrived with the slow care of a blade returning to a sheath. She had known a version of these words might come, but she had not expected the timing, the show. Catelyn's eyes went to Ned's. He felt the weight of every gaze that called him lord. He also felt the fine bones of his daughter's hands as they had clutched his finger when she learned finger from hand. The air between him and Robert seemed to fill with old winters and promises made under harder skies. He stood. He did not touch the king, because friendship is not a cloak to throw over every season. "Your Grace," he said. He saw Cersei's stillness. He saw the prince's bright impatience. He saw Sansa's breath catch. "Sansa is young." "We were all young," Robert said, and grinned to show that youth had not frightened him. "They'll do as we did. They'll learn. 7 bless them. There will be no finer couple in the land. Come, Ned. Say the word and the Septon says the rest." "There is no Septon at Winterfell," Catelyn said, level as water finding level. "Only our little chapel. The old gods. We brought our own," Cersei said, honeyed with steel. She made a small gesture, and a thin man in green and gold stepped from behind the queen's chairs with the expression of someone who had found a rare coin and discovered it was counterfeit. "Septon Osric is with us on the progress. He will be honored to bind what the king binds." Septon Osric spread his hands in a shape that meant humility to some and helplessness to others. Ned's mouth was dry, as if the fire had eaten all the moisture from the hall and left him standing in the hearth. He did not think of politics in that moment. He thought of Sansa's small white winter gloves with the little blue flowers stitched by her own uneven hand, and of the way she counted the stars on clear nights and made a wish she did not speak. He thought of the old gods who do not bind marriages in words but in the quiet that comes after. He thought of the eyes that watched every move of his face now for permission to be relieved or offended. He measured the cost of refusal and found that it could not be paid without blood, and the first blood would come from his own house, and it would not be clean. Robert's force would turn to anger in front of 100 ears. The queen would hide her satisfaction, which meant there would be more of it later. He needed the hour, the night, the slow conversation in a private room. He had none of those. He had a hall. He had a daughter who was watching him learn to let a king turn a father into a lord. "The pledge can be made," he heard himself say. The words were as heavy as wet wool. "They are of an age to say vows in the sight of the seven, and the rest can wait until they are ready." He made himself look at Sansa then, and he tried to put in his eyes the part of father that survives even this. "If this is your wish, Sansa." Sansa's heart vaulted and hung. Every song she knew beat its wings in her chest. She did not wholly understand what had been asked of her and what had been taken from her, because she was young, and because the hall was so bright and the prince's hair had gathered all the candlelight and made it obedient. She looked to her mother, who gave her back a look without panic. Catelyn's eyes said, "Breathe." Sansa took a breath that did not quite reach the bottom of her lungs. "I would be honored, your grace." "There," Robert crowed, almost tender. "There. The girl has more courage than half my lords." He thumped Ned's shoulder and spilled more wine on ancient wood. "Tomorrow, then, we'll do it tidy enough for the singers. Wolf and stag. Let Tywin hear it and cough up a sour apple." Cersei's smile did not change. Joffrey, hearing his name bound to another's like a horse harnessed to a wagon, inclined his head to Sansa. "I shall make you proud," he said, but the words were for the room. The hound's face did something that could have been contempt or could have been the leftover ache of old fire. Tyrion clapped until his palms were pink, then poured himself another cup. The hall let out its breath in song and talk and pretense. The decision fell through Winterfell like thaw water, finding cracks. Catelyn's hand remained steady on the table, but she felt the old gods would earth underfoot even here, as if roots threaded the stones and pressed upward when men tried to nail the world down. Ned sat when the king pulled him down, and he smiled when the king demanded smiling, and inside he arranged an order of tasks he would execute with a steward's precision, because if there was no wisdom to be had tonight, then there could be clean action. When the tables were cleared enough to call it done, the torches hissed with their own fatigue, and people began to sort themselves into those who would drink more and those who would find a bed and those who would linger because waking life still had them by the sleeve. Sansa slipped from Septa Mordane's side and went looking for a place where the sound changed. She found a dark passage, and Lady found it first, and Sansa sank to her knees and held the direwolf's neck with both arms. "I am not afraid," she whispered, and tried the words on her tongue. Lady's breath, with its meat and fur and snow, filled Sansa's nose and gave her something true. "He will be like the stories. He will be better. He will be kind." Lady's eyes were old and clear, with a knowing that made wishes look like lanterns. Arya, who had tried to steal 2 honey cakes and had managed 1.5, lay awake and watched the ceiling beam keep its own counsel. Nymeria lay with her head on Arya's ankle like a weight that could pull a girl out of her body if needed. Arya thought of Joffrey's voice and how it pointed at things. She thought of Sansa's smile when the prince had looked at her and how it had made something sour move under Arya's tongue. She listened to the castle's night noises, the drip where the heat met the snow, the soft lowing of a cow who had had enough of winter, the guard whose boots said he had a limp from a healed wrong. She closed her eyes only when she understood that the morning would come whether she watched for it or not. Ned and Catelyn spoke in their chamber in voices they had learned after their first child. They did not argue. They laid stones. "He gave us no room," Catelyn said. She had loosened her hair and let it fall. It looked less like a banner now and more like what a woman hides behind. He did not even ask if it was Sansa's wish. He asked the hall if it would cheer. He hoped it would become the same thing, Ned said. He sat on the bed with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose. "I tried to turn it to time. We will have that, at least. The Queen will not waste time. She will write tonight. She will make this look like a thing she wanted and managed." Catelyn drew a breath through her nose and made herself calmer than she was. I will see to the septon and to the vestments for Sansa, such as we have. I will see that the vows are clear and that nothing else is. I will see that our daughter can walk through it without stumbling over the stones others have placed. She will have her father's arm, Ned said. She will have her mother's eyes on everyone who looks at her, Catelyn returned. Ned reached and took her hand and kissed the palm like a man who has run out of words and wishes to know whether the body's truth can suffice. Catelyn held his hand there for a moment. They slept poorly and not at the same time. Dawn came gray and reluctant, the kind of light the North trusts. Smoke rose straight and thin from the kitchens. Septon Osric stared for a long time at the little chapel's altar and then at his own traveling case, in which lay the tools for sanctifying and for impressing, depending on what the day called for. He had a soft mouth that made him look more uncertain than he was. When the Queen's steward informed him of the hour, he bowed as if the bow itself were a correction. Sansa's gown was sky-colored and edged in white. Catelyn smoothed it with hands that had smooth newborn hair and the backs of fevers. Septa Mordain pinned the last ribbon without comment and nodded. Sansa's stomach was a tight knot that did not untie when she smiled at herself in the small polished plate. Lady watched every motion. When Sansa stood, the direwolf rose with her, a pale mirror. "You must leave, lady," Septa Mordain began, but Catelyn said without looking away from her daughter, "She will come. The king will not object." The Septa's mouth made a small shape of disapproval that had no teeth in this house. Joffrey's clothes were black and gold and knew they were splendid. He admired himself in a glass as well and did not see himself but the crown that would one day sit above his head. Cersei adjusted the fall of his collar with deft fingers. She took in a boy's face and measured a man's power and found both lacking only where the world would not answer in the right key. "You will stand with dignity," she said. "You will speak clearly. You will not let them see how this was not our idea." "It was the king's idea," Joffrey said, and something in the word king tasted like sour wine. "Your father's idea is yours now," Cersei said softly. "Take it and make it seem as if you invented it. Men like to believe it was always going to be so." He nodded because nodding was an action and action made him feel like a sword. The chapel smelled of beeswax and wool and the faint ghost of Catelyn's Tully incense. The hearth kept the air temperate without daring to make it rich. Septon Osric lifted his hands and murmured old words that had the same shape in Winterfell as they did in Old Town. And if they sounded thinner here, it was because the old gods listening outside the walls were not impressed by southern syllables. Ned stood on Sansa's left with his jaw set. Catelyn stood on her right with her mouth soft and her eyes hard. Robert had recovered enough to look solemn, which was his version of holy. Cersei was a statue carved in living gold. The Hound, more scar than man, watched Sansa as a master mason regards a fragile arch-Tyrion was nowhere, which meant everywhere. Lady lay down at Sansa's feet without being told, her nose resting on her paws, eyes endless. The Septa would have protested, but the king, seeing the animal, barked a laugh that made protest seem petty. Nymeria was not allowed inside. Arya stood far enough back to pretend that was her choice. Jon stood with the guards along the wall. He had his plain face on, the one that hid all other faces. Sansa's hand lay in Joffrey's, and his grip surprised her. It was firm to the point of pain, not the pressure of comfort but of ownership. She did not flinch. She felt the eyes of the room on the place where their hands met, and she pretended the pressure was the support songs praised. The Septon's words wove around them, a net of sound. Joffrey spoke his vow clearly, as if he had practiced it, which he had, long ago with a tutor who had smelled of dust and disinterest. Sansa spoke hers with a slight tremor for the first line and none thereafter. Her voice learned itself as it walked the aisle of the words. When it was done, when the knots were tied and the prayers offered and the sign made that satisfied the seven without offending the weirwood, the Septon lowered his hands, and Robert said, "There it is." Then, like a man who had finished a task he had put off too long, he kissed Sansa's brow with no lechery and clapped Joffrey once in a gesture that might have been affection if the boy had not leaned to avoid wine. The queen kissed Sansa's cheeks and left no wetness, only the faintest trace of something like lavender and wintercut. Outside, the day had decided to be cold without drama. The wind came around corners and under cloaks, a neighbor both known and unwelcome. In the yard, people found ways to act as if a wedding had happened and they were part of it. Some sang, some drank, some worked because work does not stop for vows. The king demanded archery to clear his head and was obliged, with hay bales dragged and painted circles tacked. Joffrey, bright with a new weight on his finger and old scorn in his marrow, drew and loosed until the targets were so full of shafts they looked like hedgehogs. He hit often. He did not hit enough to satisfy himself. When a guard stumbled in resetting the straw, Joffrey's mouth twisted. "Are you a coward that you flinch at sticks?" The hound said nothing. He had learned long ago that some fires grow with air. Robb watched, not as a boy watches a boy, but as a young lord watches a man who might be one day his king. He saw the impatience. He saw the way Joffrey's eyes slid past people, not into them. He felt a sudden and ungracious irritation at the boy's shoulders and the tilt of his chin, which reminded Robb unpleasantly of the gentleman from White Harbor who had come to winter in the castle one year and had demanded that the snow be shoveled away from their boots before they would deign to step down from their coach. The feeling did not do him credit. He let it pass. He made a note, and he did not know yet what he would do with it. Arya approached with Nymeria at heel and an expression like a dare. The prince's eyes went to the wolf, and then to the girl's hair that refused to make peace with ribbons. He smirked because smirking cost him nothing and paid him back. "Keep your mutt from me," he said. "She's not a mutt," Arya said, and Nymeria's ears tipped forward, bored and ready. "She's a direwolf. She's smarter than most people in this yard." The hound made a sound low in his throat that might have been amusement if a cough had strangled it first. Robb stepped in before Joffrey's temper could find the shape of the day. "My sister speaks too freely," he said in a tone that asked her to stop without humiliating her. "We mean no offense, your grace. The wolves are part of the house." "Then keep them where servants belong," Joffrey said, and took aim again with a flourish that would have looked better if the arrow had struck closer to the center. It struck. It did not center. He scowled at the target as if the painted rings had moved to displease him. "Your shot was good," Sansa said quickly, loyalty leaping like a spark. She had not left his side except to let the queen draw her away to tell her something about the journey south that sounded like a schedule and felt like a commandment. "Very good." He glanced at her. His expression softened by half a degree, which was the measure of his generosity. Of course it was. Later, when the archery had ceased and the king had found an excuse to bellow at a hound and then laugh when it cringed and then give it a scrap of meat so he could feel better about himself, Ned found Robert in the Godswood, which had tolerated many kinds of men because time makes tolerance a necessity. Robert did not like the Godswood. It made him uneasy, as if a creature older than his story were holding him to an account he could not pay with charm or strength. He stood under the bleeding eyes and did not look at them. He looked at the water and flung a pebble and missed. "You put me in a corner," Ned said. He did not waste courtesy on what had already been done. "Before my daughter, before my hall. I put us both where we needed to be," Robert answered. He spread his hands in a shrug that admitted fault without agreeing it was a fault. "You will be hand. I will have a friend. Your daughter will be a queen. The North will be tethered to the crown by more than debt. The Lannisters. The Lannisters were your name," Ned said, not gently. "You have already given them everything they demanded just by asking you to be the man you are. This?" He gestured back toward the keep where the day organized itself around the fact that it had swallowed a marriage. "This makes my child a piece in that game. Everything is a piece in some game or other." Robert looked at the heart tree with a challenge he did not feel. "You were always too pious about such things, Ned. You think if you refuse to move a piece, the game stops. I think if you forget that pieces have names, you lose yourself faster than you can drink." Robert laughed, and the sound was not cruel. It was sad, but it hid. "You have not changed as much as I hoped. Good. I need a man who makes me feel like the boy I was The boy who could believe straight lines ran true. "Come south with me. The realm is rotten where it shows gold. I need you in that rot. I need someone to keep me from drowning where wine isn't deep enough." He stopped and looked at the red leaves finally. "And if you won't do it for me, do it because your daughter is bound to my son now. Better to be near the fire than hear it described by men who warm their hands at it." Ned looked at the carving that had watched generations swear that they would live in a clean world and then fail. He had already known he would go. He had known it when the horns sounded, when he saw Robert's smile and the queen's poise and the prince's chin. He did not say he would. He said, "We will do this properly. We will not allow the betting. They are too young. Let the South laugh. I do not care." His voice carried the iron of a place that had taught him. "We will go slow where the world wants quickness." Robert grimaced and then nodded. "What man am I that I would disagree with you about my own children? Done. Let them keep their clothes and their dignity." He clapped Ned on the shoulder and looked smaller under the leaves. "I am not good at the slow things, Ned. I break them or I hurry them or I sleep while they go on without me. You are better. That is why you drive me mad. That is why I came." Cersei wrote late into the morning. The light from the narrow window made a precise rectangle on the table and cut it into her hand like a shard as she moved. Her lettering was clean without being artful. She did not scent the wax. She ended each message with a seal more carefully pressed than any kiss. To her father she wrote with just enough joy to veil the concern that must draw him across leagues in thought. To her uncle she wrote like a queen who trusted him with no power but his own understanding. To Pycelle she wrote a request disguised as notice. To Littlefinger she wrote nothing, knowing he would hear anyway, and that his version of the truth would serve or ruin her, and that the difference between those was sometimes one coin. She sent the letters away with men whose faces were small in her mind. When she had finished, she considered Sansa not as a girl but as a new lever. The North would now be in the capital, its eyes in a child's head. That pleased her. It meant that what Winterfell heard would be what she allowed through a set of small gates. Yet the marriage had been Robert's flourish, not hers. She did not like being forced to smile. She called for Joffrey and smoothed the hair above his ear when he entered, lowering his prickliness by degree. "Do you know what you have gained?" she asked him. "A wife," he said, which was a boy's answer. "A throat," she said softly, and he blinked. "A voice not your own. When you hold it, you will think about how to use it. When you do not hold it, you will think about how to get it back. Learn that feeling. Rule with it, but learn to make her love you, too." The last words were a study in difficulty. She had learned long ago that love was a torch you could hold by the wrong end. He looked away, embarrassed by talk of love as if it were dirt on his sleeve. "She already does," he said, with that petulant confidence that made Cersei remember too well the soft belly of a stag that had grown fat on victory. "Then do not teach her to hate you," she said, and knew he might anyway. She knew children. They broke what was in their hands because they wanted to know the secret of its working. Robb found Jon on the battlements in a patch of sun that had decided to be generous. The day seemed, for a moment, ordinary. Men below led horses to water. Smoke went up in a straight line. The world pretended. Jon leaned on the stone and looked south with all the hunger of a boy who had learned to make do with what was left to him. "You'll ride with us," Robb said, the words hopeful and naive. "I'll ride," Jon said. "Not with you. To the wall." He had said the same to his uncle the night before, and Benjen had watched him with eyes that had learned what North truly was and had not been able to be shocked by a boy's reasons. "Stay," Robb said, "because that was what you said when a person stood on the edge of something you could not name. It will be different. You've seen how it is now. You could be a shadow in a warmer room?" Jon asked and smiled because he liked his brother too much to sharpen the line. "It is not worse to be a shadow where shadows are wanted." He looked down into the yard where Sansa walked between Septa Mordain and Catelyn, the queen behind them like a cold wind. "I will go where names are plainer. The wolves are not welcome where the king wants to walk without watching his footing." Robb could have argued 10 more reasons. He let them sit on his tongue unsaid. "Then I will come to the wall one day." "One day," Jon echoed. He touched Robb's shoulder, a small, sufficient act. He would tell Arya first because she would understand. He would not tell Sansa until he could not avoid it, because her face would make him feel like a thief rising in daylight. Tyrion Lannister found the top of Winterfell's gatehouse to his liking because the view there fit inside his head. A big view, oddly enough, made him comfortable. It reassured him that he could not see everything, so he should not pretend. He drank carefully from a skin, for he had learned to husband pleasure as a farmer husbands seed. Jon found him without meaning to, which was often how men found Tyrion, at the edge of a thing they thought they understood. They stood together, not as friends but as men who had decided not to dislike one another. "I suppose I should offer advice," Tyrion said. "It is what men of my age and stature do when they meet boys leaving for places they would visit only in stories if they had any sense." Jon smiled despite himself. "I won't ask for it." "Very wise." Tyrion took a small drink. "You will make vows. Keep them even when they become inconvenient. Not because that makes you good, mind you, because that makes you yourself. And that will be a rare commodity, south or north." He glanced down at Sansa, a splash of blue moving along a corridor of darker colors. "Marriages arranged at any king's table are wines bottled with more sediment than you can imagine. Do not drown in theirs. Drown in your own if you must." He handed the skin over, and Jon took a swallow and let it burn him exactly as much as he deserved. Days in Winterfell learned the shape of the change without wanting to. Sansa practiced moving with the knowledge of eyes. She learned to bend her neck just enough to please a queen without breaking it, to say words that tasted like honey and nettles both. Joffrey tolerated the north as one tolerates an inn between more important inns. He hunted and demanded and disliked the way cold came into his bones like a poor man through an unlocked door. He did not like the direwolves, which is to say he feared what they said about a place that kept them. Lady watched him with eyes that did not blink often. The hound kept a hand always on the hilt that was his first truth. Cersei sent for Catelyn and spoke to her in courtesies that did not miss their target. Catelyn answered in kind. Their conversation was ice pretending to be water. Each woman recognized the other for what she was, a power in a house that men misunderstood in essential ways. "We will treat your daughter as we treat the crown," Cersei said. "I am not reassured, Your Grace," Catelyn said mildly. "We will keep her safe," Cersei continued, "and let the word safe hang to mean many kinds of safety. Few of them the kind a mother counts. Arya climbed everywhere she should not, mostly because she did not like being told that words could do things that hands could not. She listened. She heard men in red and gold laugh at the North's ways and pretend they were not afraid of the dark that came early. She heard northern men mutter about the softness of silk. She learned where the queen's men ate when they wanted to be out of sight and where the king went when he wanted to be seen. She did not tell anyone what she knew, because she had learned that telling was a form of spending. One night, as the cold took a bite it hadn't had the appetite for earlier, Ned went again to the crypts, as if going there would let him think without the castle putting its expectations on him through its stones. He stood before Lyanna until he did not feel the urge to apologize for being alive. He placed his hand on the spear of iron laid across the stone figure's knees and felt nothing because iron is iron and not a brother. "I have given Sansa to the crown," he said to the dead with the humility a man feels only when he is certain he has failed and is trying to make of that failure a duty accomplished. "I will give my own years to follow. Keep her if the old gods keep anything." He turned and found someone else in the shadows, a shape that did not startle because the dead were old friends here. It was Tyrion, quiet as a second thought. "Forgive me," the dwarf said. "I find the company down here superior to the company above." "You are far from home," Ned said. He did not like to be surprised, and he did not like to find a Lannister where he came to take off the coat of being a lord. "I am always far from home," Tyrion said lightly, and then, after a pause, not lightly, "My father thinks the world is a map that belongs under his hand. I prefer to look up at it painted on the ceiling. It humbles, a rare virtue in my family." Humility is not a virtue I have seen in the Lannisters, Ned said. Then keep looking elsewhere, Tyrion replied. We hoard our rarest things. He watched Ned by the light that insisted it was enough. Your daughter will be safe in King's Landing, he said, and then made a face that admitted the word safe had been dragged through too narrow a door. Safer than she will be anywhere else if the king insists. Better for you to come. Better for her to have someone in a room with a shut door who remembers who she was before she was a piece. He lifted a hand. That was meant kindly. Comes ill from my mouth. I know. Ned inclined his head once, as much in thanks as he could muster. I will come. The king asks my friendship and has made it an order. It is always like that, Tyrion said. Kings ruin friendship as winter ruins roads. When the ravens took wing with the news, they seeded it over the realm like strange grain. In Dragonstone, where the sea found cliffs and made them salt and the wind carried old words, Stannis Baratheon read the letter in a chamber that had never learned warmth. He stood by the painted table and traced a coast with one blunt finger while Davos Seaworth waited with the patience of a man who owed his life to another's decision and paid it back one choice at a time. The king did this in the north, Stannis said, as if narrating an execution. Without counsel, without thought. His jaw moved as if it chewed something unpleasant and refused to spit. He thinks tying a wolf to a stag will keep the lion at bay. He does not see the teeth on the other side of the rope. Davos said nothing at first. Men around Stannis had learned not to speak quickly. Words could cut you if the wind shifted. It will bring Lord Stark to court, he offered when the silence began to seem like neglect. That is not ill. A man like that, he's as straight as a mast. The ship might steer truer with him aboard. Stannis's mouth made no concession to the metaphor. Or the mast will snap. Or the ship will run aground because a straight line is not what the sea calls for. He tapped the letter again. My brother thinks in feasts. He binds and unbinds in front of men with meat in their hands and wine on their breath. He thinks the world is loud and will be persuaded by sound. Davos thought of Celis and of the girl with the shy eyes and the scar that made strangers look away. He thought of marriage as he had known it, which was a rope, sometimes silken, sometimes hemp, sometimes wire with a mind of its own. The North holds. That much even a smuggler knows. If the king thinks this will make it hold to him, well, perhaps he is afraid of things we have not named. Stannis's eyes flicked, just enough to show he had heard something worth keeping. Afraid, he repeated, and let the words sit between them like a coin that had rolled to a stop. He is afraid of the Lannisters' hands on his purse and his children and his name. He folded the letter like a man folding a wound closed and set it aside. Send a raven to the hand, to Lord Stark. He corrected himself with a thin grimace. We will see if the man lives up to the songs the North sings about him. In King's Landing, Varys heard the news with the serene acceptance of a man who had learned that surprise is a flower men like to pin to their own coats. He floated through the Red Keep as if his feet did not care for contact and found Peter Baelish in a room shaped like a throat, narrow and fit to choke on. A marriage in the North, so sudden, Varys observed. So convenient, Peter returned, smiling as if he had invented the word convenient. One must admire the king's timing. He puts Lord Stark in a frame where refusal would crack the painting. And the queen, she smiles. She is very good at it. 2 houses bound, Varys said. A wolf led south by honey. We will see how much of the wolf remains when it arrives. He folded his hands and let his sleeves arrange themselves around them. Little birds will have to learn new songs. Teach them well, Peter said, and flicked a piece of lint from his sleeve as if it were a rumor he had decided to discard. When the day's light began to thin, Winterfell let out a long, strong breath and prepared for the next thing that would be asked of it. Sansa sat on the bench near the small fire in her chamber and let Septa Mordain unpin her hair. The pins clicked in the dish like a language. You spoke your vows clearly, the Septa said. Praise felt like the smooth side of a coin worn by many hands. Sansa nodded. She had not cried since. She had not thought to. Her mind was busy laying out rooms it did not know how to furnish. She imagined a city she had never seen. She imagined a life where she walked with another person's eyes on her shoulder blades. "Will it be very different?" she asked, and knew the question was foolish as soon as it left the small warm place it had been. "Yes," Septa Mordain said gently. "Different is not always worse." She placed a careful strand of hair behind Sansa's ear and let her hand rest for a moment. "You will learn. You are good at learning when you wish to be." Sansa leaned into the touch, just enough. Lady huffed in her sleep and twitched a paw as if running across a field no one else could see. Arya climbed along the inside of the wall walk with Nymeria shadowing her until she crouched where she could see most of everything and no one could see her. She felt incidental and central at once. She thought of the day she would ride at the head of her own story and make other people step aside because she had a banner that was not made of cloth. She scratched Nymeria behind the ear and the wolf leaned heavier against her leg. Solid, indisputable. "We won't let them hurt Sansa," Arya said, and the promise tasted better than any honey cake. In their chamber, Ned and Catelyn lay close without making a shape of it that anyone else would recognize. They spoke the practicalities of departure and held each other in the spaces between those words. They did not speak of fear often. They had learned long ago that it became hungrier when fed. They spoke instead of blankets and guards, and the way Maester Luwin would prepare copies of ledgers for Robb to study until his head ached and the ache turned into a neck. Robb took those ledgers without protest and sat with them until the numbers became stories and the stories became men he knew by name. He ran his finger down columns and imagined supply lines and snowfalls and the way a river's rise in spring could make fools of plans. He stood out under the night afterward and let the air sting his teeth. He felt Sansa newly. She had always been his sister. Now she was also a bridge between worlds he did not trust. He whispered her name into the dark as if doing so would make the bridge stronger. Joffrey lay in a feather bed he had not asked to lie in and stared at beams cut by a northern saw. He thought of Sansa with a faint irritation at how much she admired him. Admiration bored him unless it came from men he envied. He touched the ring on his finger and considered how it made his hand look. He liked that. He disliked the wolves. He disliked the cold. He disliked the way the king's friends' eyes had looked at him as if they had a right. He turned on his side. He dreamed of a stag running and of arrows multiplied until they made a fence. He woke dissatisfied with himself for dreaming at all. The morning after the wedding, men spoke of routes. The royal party would not linger. King's Landing tugged at it like a tide. Ned's household scrambled to answer 100 small demands that no one had imagined until the Queen voiced them. Sansa walked slow along the covered way with Lady, and people moved to either side without thinking because they saw not Sansa but a shape of future. She nodded in a way that made them feel seen enough to like her and not enough to forget she was not theirs. She wore a little smile that cost her less than it used to. She stopped by the window that looked out on the training yard where Robb and Jon had made noise and Theon had laughed too loudly. She watched it empty and half expected to see their younger selves still there, shadows practicing. Arya came up at a run and stopped only because Lady lifted her head. "Don't go," Arya said, making a child's demand with a voice that had begun to learn how not to plead. "I have to," Sansa said, which was true in 100 ways. She took Arya's hand. It had scratches on it that would scar into white lines if she grew slowly enough. "You'll come later, when Father says." Arya scowled at the idea of permission. "If he says no? Then you'll come anyway," Sansa said before she could stop herself, and then laughed at the horror on Arya's face and at the way it mirrored something in her own chest. "Don't," she added quickly, and squeezed Arya's fingers. "Don't make it worse. I'll send letters." "I'll make sure you get them," Arya said, more fiercely than the task demanded. And Sansa understood that this was love as Arya could manage it. They stood like that for a long breath, with Lady watching them and Nymeria choosing, for once, to lie down. Ned stood beside the king as the stables filled with motion. Men lifted saddles as if they were lifting time onto a horse's back. Grooms adjusted straps with the care of men who knew that a small oversight could break a spine. The hound inspected the prince's gear with a practiced eye that did not pause to flatter. Cersei mounted with the same economy she gave to everything. "You will not like the road," Robert said to Ned, his voice already warming itself on the prospect of travel. "But at the end there's wine and something like power. I will be content if there is truth," Ned said, and did not look at the prince or the queen or the girl he had given to them. He looked at the men of Winterfell who would remain and at Robb, who came and went across the yard, his energies rough and useful. He looked at the tower windows where Catelyn's profile came and went like a candle behind a thick shade. "Truth," Robert scoffed, but not unkindly. "Truth is a coat you wear at home. At court you wear truth under something prettier and pretend it's not sweating." He grinned and shook his reins. "Come. If we dawdle, your gods will take root in my boots." The procession formed with the competent beauty of a thing men have done many times. Standards lifted, and even the wind seemed to respect the banners enough to hold steady while they unfurled. Sansa rode near the queen under the eye of men who had thought about arrows and sudden stones. Joffrey rode where he could be seen. The Hound rode where he could see. Arya watched from the battlements and learned how hard it was to stand still. Jon stood with Benjen near the gate and learned how hard it was to speak the word goodbye when it looked like the mouth of a road. They went out through Winterfell's gate under the arch that had watched Starks go before and come back changed or not at all. The sound of hooves on frozen ground was a kind of drum. People waved and shouted and lifted infants as if royalty were a kind of weather you could hold up to your child to take a measure. The party dwindled into a line and then into a point and then into the idea of a procession and then into the long low certainty that the world beyond the walls is larger than what a heart can plan for. Winterfell breathed again and returned to its older, slow work. Feeding, mending, watching the sky for signs of how deeply winter intended to push. Robb took his place where Ned had stood and felt every line of the stone under his boots. Catelyn walked the yard as if to gather up any piece of her children that had fallen loose in the departure and tuck it back for later. Arya sought Nymeria and found the wolf seeking her. Jon went to the armory and looked at the black he would wear and tried to reconcile that color with the sun he could still feel on his neck. On the road, Sansa learned the music of travel. The creak of leather, the clink of bit against tooth, the sigh of blankets adjusting on a pack. She learned the smell of a queen at close range and the way men made room for her without touching her. Joffrey rode a little ahead and looked back sometimes to check that she was still in her place. When the path narrowed to a cut through stone, the two of them found themselves closer than usual, and Joffrey lowered his voice to say something that was not unkind. It was about flowers he had seen in the south, white as milk and sweet as summer rain, and Sansa latched onto it as if it were a glimpse of gentleness. He spoke of their wedding in King's Landing with an ease that made Sansa feel like a hand that had slipped into a fine glove. He did not mention that gloves can be turned inside out. The wind leaned in, not cruelly yet, only with the honest curiosity of a season arriving to do its job. The trees along the road whispered secrets to one another no man could translate. Far off, a hunter's horn shaped the air and faded. The world did not know yet what vows had been spoken within it. It would learn. The north held and watched. The south beckoned and lied. Between them, a girl sat a horse and kept her back straight because names were arranged there. And near her a boy sat a horse and believed that names belonged under his heel. And behind them a king sought laughter the way a cold man seeks a sun he cannot see, and a father counted distances in measures that had nothing to do with miles. Night fell as if someone had poured it from a careful jug, and stars appeared, clean and cold and unburdened. In Winterfell's godswood, the heart tree kept its own counsel. The old gods listened without moving. The wind took a breath. Somewhere to the far north, beyond maps men argued over and boundaries they named to comfort themselves. Something old stirred in its sleep, as if a new knot in the south had tugged faintly at a thread the world forgot had been tied. Sansa lay in her tent under a heavy blanket that smelled of fresh cloth and horse and thought of the Septon's voice and the weight of a ring and the way lady's fur had felt under her palm as she stood. She did not know yet the shapes her life would take, only that they would be narrower and taller, with windows that showed a sea she had only ever read of. She put her hand to her throat where she felt her pulse and whispered a name. Not Joffrey's, not even her own. It was a smaller name, the name of a girl who had run in these halls and counted stars and thought songs safer than they are. She did not say goodbye to that girl. There would be time to say it, or there would not. Either way, the night would lift its black by morning and make room for another day to test the vows that words had made and the silences had accepted. In Winterfell, Ned looked over a letter he had written and not yet sent, his script square and careful. He sealed it and set it aside and blew out the candle because darkness was not an enemy here. In Dragonstone, Stannis turned from the painted table and stared into a hearth as if he carried a ledger in his head that no fire could burn. In King's Landing, Varys reached for a small bell and did not ring it, and Peter Baelish opened a window to hear whether the city had learned the news as if it were gossip or gospel. The wall loomed untouched by any of this and waited, and men whose names had fallen out of circulation shouldered pikes and learned to ignore hunger they had named a companion. The road bent. The party moved along it like beads on a string, and every bead carried a world inside. Sansa slept. Joffrey pretended not to. The Hound listened. The Queen planned. The King dreamed of the only fight he ever wanted to fight again. The wolves in Winterfell dreamed of running. The old gods dreamed in ways men cannot recognize. Morning would bring dust and orders and small choices that open into large. For now there was only breath and the weight of blankets and the knowledge, shaky as a new colt, that something had begun which no man in the Seven Kingdoms could stop by wanting it stopped. The stars said nothing. They rarely do. They only kept their places, and that, in its way, is an answer. The road taught the ear first. Leather creaked as if racks of old doors were whispering. Harness buckles clicked like a thin hail. Hooves sifted mud and frost. Wheels found ruts they had not made and complained as if they remembered a different route. When the wind got curious, it moved under cloaks like a hand. Sansa learned that this, too, was a way to be royal. To move while others measured your movement, to be taken from one room to another even when there were no roofs. She learned to sit straight without becoming a post. She learned which aches could be ignored and which would become a limp if she let them. Lady did not complain. The dire wolf took the road as if it had been laid down for her paws. She drifted beside Sansa's palfrey, sometimes slipping ahead to scent a hedgerow, sometimes falling back to regard the Kingsguard's horses with the unblinking civility of a creature that will not be startled by men. The Queen's men watched her and did not speak the words that perched behind their teeth. The Hound watched her without words, too, but his silence said different things. Joffrey would look at Lady and then at Sansa and then at the trees, as if one of the three had wronged him and he had not yet decided which. On the second day, the King demanded a hunt, which meant an hour of getting ready and 2 of arguing about what getting ready meant and 1 of meatless pursuit before a stag slashed through a thicket so quickly that half the party allowed themselves a story about a glimpse. Robert laughed at himself as if he had outwitted fate by making the jest first, drank, and ordered a fire big enough to make the dusk retreat. Sansa thought of telling him that Lady disliked large fires. Wolves preferred small, honest flames that did not try to shape the night. She said nothing. She watched Joffrey drink less than his father and more than he would admit to the Queen. He liked to taste. He disliked to be seen tasting. The King's progress pulled half a world with it. Cooks, grooms, teamsters, a smith with arms like black tree roots, 2 minstrels who hated each other more than they loved music, a sweating steward who had memorized the measure of bread an army must swallow to keep walking. There were laundresses, a prickly master of horse, pages who ran until they dreamt of running, guards who arranged themselves like teeth when the path narrowed, a maester with travel-sick eyes who walked as if the humors would right themselves if he kept moving, and, because roads are nets as often as they are ropes, merchants who attached at stops like burrs. Septa Mordain rode with more grace than her age had promised, her mouth a straight line that softened when Sansa looked at her. The Queen moved within all this as a needle moves within cloth, unerring and cold, drawing a line only she understood. She spoke to Sansa when others could hear. "You have a good seat," Cersei said, which could mean many things, and none of them what Sansa wanted it to mean. "Thank you, Your Grace," Sansa said. She kept her hands light and her back calm. She did not ask if she had pleased the prince. because that question had begun to feel like a loose thread that would pull a sleeve away if touched. "Joffrey is not unpleased" became the message often relayed to her on small feet by larger faces. He liked how she listened. He disliked when she corrected him without meaning to, simply by remembering something she had actually seen. He liked to tell her about King's Landing, about a night's melee on the Street of Steel where two men had beaten each other senseless over the right to carry a house's colors while no one from that house had deigned to appear, about the hills of the city that smelled different depending on the hour, mint and tallow and brine and rot, about the Red Keep's tower where the wind turned slaps to whispers. He did not tell her how often he grew bored in those places. He told her about the white hart they would hunt when summer stopped cheating and made way for something wetter. On the fourth day, rain took a small bite and left teeth marks. The road turned to a color that remembered the last hoof to pass more intimately than it had to. The king mocked the sky and took a draught to teach it manners and rode on beneath a mantle of wet that would have made another man mean. He did not grow mean. He grew loud and tender. When he felt generous, he made promises no parchment could hold. Ned rode near, listening for the part of Robert that wanted to be a man and not a cheer. They reached a swollen stream and waited to cross one at a time across a line of stones men had arranged when the water had been polite. Men cursed their horses, then apologized to them, then cursed them again. Sansa watched Arya go most of the way without wetting a boot and then leap the last with a whoop that got inside ladies' ears and made them turn. Joffrey rolled his eyes where Sansa could see. The hound did not look at the water or the girl. He looked upstream as if counting rain somewhere far above them. It was after the stream, when the road narrowed between young trees with the audacity of growth, that Arya disappeared in the way children do, not by magic but by refusal to be seen. Septa Mordane scolded the air. Robb started to go after her and stopped when the queen's guards bristled like a hedge and the queen lifted 2 fingers the smallest distance. "She will find her way back to the camp," Cersei said without looking at Ned. "Or your dire wolf will find her for you." "She will return when she is ready," Ned said. He did not explain his children to anyone who did not care to understand them. He sent a man with a quiet step and a better patience than a hound and told Sansa not to worry and told himself the same. Sansa did not need telling. Lady told her with a look. Still, supper tasted of the search until Arya came sidling through the firelight with leaves in her hair and Nymeria at her knee and a look on her face that said she had done a thing she would not apologize for. "What did you do?" Sansa asked her when there was a moment and only honeyed carrot between them, for Septa Mordane had decided that vegetables made tempers easier to bind. "I met a boy," Arya said around the last of her carrot, which she had not deserved and had stolen anyway from her own plate, which was a lesson in necessity. "He's a butcher's boy. He has a practice sword. We fought." She grinned. "He fights like a boy who will learn to fight." Sansa could not help but be drawn. Practice swords meant the shape of a story. "And you won." "I learned," Arya said, which was better than winning. "Come tomorrow. You can watch." Sansa's heart made a small skittering animal in her ribs. "Joffrey would not like it," she said, before she knew to swallow the words. "Oh," Arya said, and then her face did something that had no name between sisters. It was not contempt and not pity. It was understanding without mercy. "You're Joffrey's now." "I am myself," Sansa said, perhaps too quickly. "If you say so." Arya tossed her scraping to Nymeria and left a little of her scorn on the ground where Sansa could find it later and turn it over until it looked like something else. It was the next afternoon when the road bent around a low knoll and then unwound into a strip of meadow that knew its own edge. The river ran beside it like someone telling a story in a hurry. The sun had remembered itself. The king had fallen back with Ned and men who remembered battle, which meant the front of the progress belonged to the prince, who liked a front. Joffrey asked Sansa if she would ride with him ahead of the column and away from the constant clink and the queen's shadow. Sansa said yes. She said yes because he asked, because sometimes he looked at her with a quickness that suggested the boy he might have been if he had belonged to a smaller house, because the day was warm and because she had told herself that you cannot learn a person by listening to their footsteps in a crowd. She said yes, and Lady came, and Ser Sandor Clegane came because he was not asked to come. He was an answer to a question no one wanted asked. They found Arya at the river's bend with a boy who had straw in his hair and new scars on his knuckles, and the look of someone who had been told often that he was not fit for certain rooms and had decided to build a different house. Arya swung her stick with the happy print of practice on it. The boy, Micah, he named himself, Butcher's boy from the next village over on errands, swung his with a stubborn kindness that Sansa recognized from her father's eyes. They were much too near the horses. They were much too near the prince's pride. "What is this?" Joffrey asked, and all the light slid off the question. He did not shout. Shouting would have been less frightening. He smiled instead, and Sansa had learned to fear that smile now that it was hers to study. "Who gave you leave to play at swords?" Arya's chin lifted, which meant trouble. "No one gives leave," she said. "We are practicing. That is how people stop being fools, Your Grace." Joffrey glanced at Sansa as if to see whether she would say his name properly for him. She did not speak at all. There was no yes that wouldn't cut someone. He dismounted with a smoothness he loved and pulled the sword at his side an inch from its sheath. He had named it Lion's Tooth, ridiculous and perfect, a thing made more dangerous by the laugh in it. Practice? With a butcher's boy. He stepped so the water threw his shadow onto their legs. "Come then. I will show you practice." Micah stood with his stick uncertainly, courage walking up his throat one slow step at a time. He looked to Arya, and Sansa saw him realize that this was not her fight and that all help is sometimes an insult. "I did not mean. You meant to lift a stick in front of a prince," Joffrey said. He drew in full and let the river reflect a line of light. "Say you meant it." "Stop," Sansa said, finally finding the voice that had been kicking at her. "He did not. Lions do not ask permission of sheep," Joffrey said to the boy. He stepped closer, and Sansa watched his face change, watched the part of him that liked flowers give way to the part of him that liked to see a thing yield. Arya did not wait. She planted herself between them with the stubborn grace that made grown men groan and love her. "Hit me then," she said, "if you need practice." Joffrey laughed. It was not yet a cruel laugh. It wanted to be and was practicing. "I do not practice on girls, little wolf." "Why? Afraid I'll bite." It went wrong with the speed of a colt spooked by something no one else had seen. Joffrey made the lazy choice, to lash out with the flat of his blade and teach someone to stay in her place without drawing blood, and he did not calculate the wolf. Nymeria's snarl arrived in the same instant as the blade. The hound's horse backstepped, trained to hold still but sensible enough to prefer distance. Lady stood, not moving. Sansa felt her hand go to her throat without command. Joffrey's sword licked out. Arya jerked. The flat struck her arm and made a sound like meat hit wrong. Micah moved in reflex. The prince turned, angry now, unshaped anger, and the edge kissed the boy's cheek by accident that wanted to be intention. Blood came, bright and indecorous. Nymeria landed. Teeth found the meat of the prince's wrist, his sword wrist, and the world made a small sharp sound inside Sansa's ears that she would remember longer than she would be able to tell this story. Joffrey screamed. That was real. Not royal at all. The hound moved like a blade leaving a joiner's hand. Fluid, efficient, after the fact as always. He did not cut the wolf. He kicked at ribs with a boot and threw his cloak like a net. Nymeria was no fool. She let go, snapped once at the cloth to make it smell of her teeth forever, backed and was gone between two shadows that had not been there. Silence made the trees ring. Joffrey clutched his wrist, blood making a glove of his skin. He began to weep with rage and shame, and that made something dangerous happen in Sansa's chest. She had seen boys weep. She had comforted them. This weeping wanted a throat. He rounded on Arya and Micah with the sword still in hand and the hound's hand on his arm, not gently. "Call your wolf," the hound said to Arya, not because he expected obedience, but because words sometimes slowed the horse before it ran blindly. "Call it back. Do it now." Arya's face had become a mask she had made often in play and knew how to wear. Her arm throbbed and would bruise. She looked at the trees and said in the oldest voice she had, "Go!" Nymeria, hearing only the shape of that voice in her memory now, did not return. She had made her choice already. Arya took a breath that hurt and straightened. He hurt Micah. I won't let him. Sansa moved without deciding to. She went to Joffrey with her hands held out and her words simple. We must bind it. You will faint if we do not. Your Grace. Joffrey. She said his name like a bridge she did not trust. The hound kept his hand on the prince's arm and watched Sansa as if she were a knife a child had been given to play with. There was admiration in his look, and there was a little sorrow. Ser Sandor tore a strip from his own cloak. He had done it before. The cloth came away the right way. He wrapped Joffrey's wrist with a competence that had nothing to do with love. We ride back, he said. Now. We take the boy. Joffrey hissed, breath running ragged, pride grasping about for a thing it could crush and lift. He is a butcher's whelp who struck a prince. He loses the hand. He is a boy, Sansa said, and there was more steel in her than she had counted on having. She looked at the hound without flinching, as if he were a man and not a story. He is a boy. He raised a stick to a prince. The hound returned, no anger, as if instructing a dog not to steal bread. That is a man's crime. Micah did not run. He seemed to have remembered his feet but not their uses. He stood with blood on his cheek and a face set hard against tears and a piece of river light on his hair. I did not mean, he started and swallowed the rest. Arya turned to him as if to push him with her hands away from the shape of this moment. Run, she said. Now. He ran. He ran with the sudden terrible grace of someone who has remembered what being alive costs. The hound could have taken him with a horse, but he did not. He stood and watched and held the prince's arm and made a decision Sansa could not read. They rode back in a knot of anger and secrecy that could not hold. Secrets do not keep long in a moving camp. Motion shakes them and they jab through the seams. By the time they reached the king's fire, the tale had run up and down 3 times and altered itself at each telling until there were 4 wolves, or none, until the butcher's boy had been armed with steel, or with a look that could kill. The queen stepped into the space the tale created with the ease of a woman who always knows where the center of a room is. She took her son's hand and lifted it and did not flinch at the blood. What happened? She asked, and the words were already a verdict. He attacked me, Joffrey said, face white with heat and humiliation. It is an old truth that boys who have been made to cry become dangerous. The wolf. The wolf, the queen repeated, and the word grew fangs. She turned her face to Ned and then to the king as if she had never seen either man before and was choosing between 2 knives. My son is attacked, and a wolf bites him. What redress will be made for a prince? Robert looked at the wound and then at the boy and then at the boy's mother and then at Ned. He wanted more wine. He wanted a boar. He wanted the day when he could not be made to feel ashamed by a child's cut. It was a child's quarrel, he said. We'll not make meat of it. He looked at Arya and then at Sansa and winced as if he could see the line that split a father from a king and had walked it too long. Where is the wolf, girl? Gone, Arya said, proud of the word and bereft of it at once. I sent her away. Cersei's smile was the thin one she kept for moments when men thought mercy could still be purchased. Then bring me the other. They had 2. If the beast that did it cannot be found, another will do. The lesson is the same. No, Sansa said, and the sound came from a place Lady had taught her to find. She took 1 step forward with the care you would use near a deep hole. Your Grace, please. Lady would never. She did nothing. She is mine. Cersei looked at her with a flat curiosity that had no space in it for girls' please. Then you must learn what mine costs, she said. 1 wolf for another. The king made an unkingly gesture, a flustered swat. 7 hells, woman. Will you have us kill a pup for a child's scuffle? The boy is fine. He'll have a scar to brag on. It's almost more than he's earned. Almost, Cersei repeated in a tone that said she had spent a life taking notes on men's almosts. You will not discipline him, I will. And the animal will be disciplined as well. Her eyes moved to Ned and stopped there. Or perhaps Lord Stark would prefer to argue that his house stands above the law. Ned felt the old cold climb his spine, one rung at a time, and hold. He looked to Robert and saw not a king but a friend who could not be counted on at the moment the count mattered. He looked at Sansa and saw a child who had been offered up to the world's way with girls. He looked at Arya and saw a wolf cub who would wreck herself on a chain rather than accept it. He looked at Lady and saw an ending that had arrived when the men began to speak in the wrong order. "Enough," Robert said, and the sound was weary. "Enough." He swallowed a swallow of air that did him no good. "Do as she says," he told Cersei, and then to Ned, shame-seeking purchase. "Make it quick. The Queen will have her lesson. We will not make sport of it. Do you hear me? We will not make sport." The Hound went at once to fetch men to secure the camp's edge and to see that no fool among the curious was trampled. He did not look at Sansa. Men cleared a circle that felt like a wound. Sansa stood inside it with Septa Mordane's hand on her arm, not tight enough to bruise and not loose enough to be undone. Lady, who had watched all this with attentive dignity, came forward when Sansa whispered her name. The dire wolf put her huge head into Sansa's hands and breathed on her palms in that way that had soothed Sansa's heart since the day the pups had been found with their eyes just open. "I will do it," Ned said, and the words tasted like rust. "She is of my house." He did not ask for a sword. One was given. It was ice-cold, not ice, the great sword that made the air hum, but still a Stark blade, the kind of steel that would hold true against a wrong wind. He knelt because Lady deserved a face she knew near hers. He put his hand to her ruff, and the fur was as it always was, thick and clean and alive. He leaned his forehead to hers and let himself breathe only once with no noise in it. "I am sorry," he said. Not to the Queen, not to the King, not to the world, to the beast who had harmed no one and who would die because a boy whose name would one day be carved above other names could not bear the pain of being bitten where he had thought himself immune. Sansa could not watch and could not look away. She watched the blade flash because blades flash. They do not drift. She heard the sound a neck makes when parted. It is a small sound. She felt something in her chest make a careful tear and fold itself smaller and tuck itself into a corner it would live in for a long time. She did not cry aloud. She put her face into Septa Mordane's side and made no sound because some grief desires to be hidden like a treasure, not displayed like a petition. Arya watched with eyes that burned and learned a lesson other than the one the Queen had set. She learned that men would ask fathers to kill their children's companions to make their point, and that a father would do it to save something else. She did not forgive any part of this. Nymeria was out there now, beyond the ring of firelight, with her mouth remembering the taste of a prince. She would run because Arya had told her to. A queen's men would run harder because the Queen had told them to. Arya did not pray. She clenched her teeth until her jaw ached and counted her breaths as if they were coins, and she would not be a debtor. That night, the camp did not settle. Even those who had not cared to watch felt something ache where sleep usually unknotted them. The king drank himself into a quiet that looked like mercy and was only exhaustion. The Queen sat with her son and stroked his hair as if to comb humiliation from it. Joffrey lay very still with his arm in a sling and his eyes open and an oath inside him that had nowhere safe to go. The Hound slept like a man who had set his own heart aside to keep his sword arm steady years ago. Sansa lay in the tent with the blanket up to her neck and her hands empty for the first time since summer, and she told herself that she would not forget the feel of fur, that she would not let the world teach her to be comforted by anything less honest. She drifted at last, and in the first shallow draft of sleep, she reached for Lady and found air and woke biting on a cry and swallowed it. At the morning, the road moved again because roads do that. The tail shrank and hardened into a thing that could be carried in a pocket. Sansa rode with a new carefulness as if the air were full of edges. The Queen looked on her with a pause that might have been approval. It is hard to tell with such women. Everything can be approval or warning, but did not alter her speech. Joffrey ignored Sansa for an hour and then for a day and then made a joke for her benefit about a peasant's awkward bow that was cruel without being clever. Sansa smiled because she must practice not showing her wounds to strangers. Later she retched behind a copse and told no one. The septa wiped her face with a wet cloth and said nothing. Some kindness is a silence, and Sansa learned to be grateful for that kind. They crossed the neck, a green wet place that thinks poorly of wheels, and men cursed the bog and the frogs and the insects with an ingenuity that made the minstrels take notes. Crannogmen watched them from the reeds if the stories were true, which they always were in the telling and rarely were in the living. Arya spat at leeches and laughed at her own alarm after. Robb's horse picked its feet up very high, offended that the earth had lost its firmness. The hound looked at the ground more than ahead. He had learned that the worst dangers are often directly under your mount. When the land rose again and dried its hands, they passed Moat Cailin. The ancient stones lay like broken teeth in a jaw that once had bit an army and would never be mended. The king saluted the ruin with his cup and a bawdy line from a song that would have made Catelyn roll her eyes. Ned looked on the ruin and remembered that walls are as mortal as men. While the south pulled them down, the north took Jon up. He left Winterfell in a small company with his uncle riding just ahead and his own thoughts riding beside him. Ghost padded where a ghost should, making no more sound than a memory. The morning they left, Robb had gripped him and said very little, and that had been a gift. Catelyn had stood at a window and not watched. Arya had hugged him and thumped him and whispered a promise she did not intend to keep about behaving. Sansa had kissed his cheek with lips that trembled and told him to write. She had not asked him to be careful because she had learned that men will not be careful when asked and will be careful when they decide to be. Tyrion went north, too, for the wall was a place a man might see once and never again, and the dwarf collected such sights as a miser collects coin. He rode a shaggy garron that looked like a barrel with a neck and treated it better than he had treated many men. He stopped where the road offered him a tree that could be climbed or a wall that begged to be sat on and drank sparingly, and made men laugh without insulting them unless insult was the coin they wanted, in which case he paid. He spoke to Jon as if the boy were not a boy, and Jon both resented and cherished this. "Take care that you keep your oaths for your own sake and not as a cudgel for others," Tyrion said once as they made camp near a place where the kin Srode tangoed with a little stream that had not been named by men. Men love to use other men's vows as bludgeons. It makes them feel holy while their knuckles bleed. "My uncle says much the same," Jon said. "He says the wall will show me what sort of man I am." "Walls do that," Tyrion said. "So do women and wine, but walls are less fun." He smiled with less bite than usual and then looked at the trees with a thoughtfulness that suggested he, too, had once believed in things and was surprised to find he still did. They reached the wall on a day the sky had remembered to be a sky and not a lid. It rose and rose and rose again until it took the horizon and shook it and made it something else. Jon stood a long time with his head thrown back and his mouth open and did not feel the cold until his teeth ached. Ghost sat and regarded the ice without awe, which Jon found comforting. The gate groaned a welcome that was not personal, the kind of welcome a man gives a duty. Men in black met them with the caution of men who have learned that anyone who comes to them brings trouble and calls it honor. Benjen was greeted with the silence due a man who has gone out and come back. Jon was shown a bed with straw that remembered a large back and told where to find a bowl of stew with a skin thick enough to be a cousin. Ser Alliser Thorne looked upon him as if he had been appointed personally to undo whatever hope Jon had brought. "Another highborn whelp come to learn what cold is," he announced in a voice that made the word cold an insult. "We'll teach you to stand up in it before it knocks you on your arse." "I know how to stand," Jon said, and the old knight's smile was a small cruel thing. "You know how to think you stand," Thorne returned. "We'll see if your legs agree." Tyrion took the measure of the place with eyes that did not blink too often and hands that stayed warm by being kept busy with a cup. He walked to the edge where men stand to look, and he looked, and for a moment his smile went away and something like prayer took its seat. "I will piss off the edge of the world," he declared after, because humor is what men use to mark the point where awe threatened to make them truthful. It is what any sensible man would do. When he left days later, he gave Jon a look that said he had taken a measure and been pleased by what he'd found and was curious what the measure would be later. "Do not imagine that coming here rescues you from anything you carry in your head," he said. The wall is not medicine. It is a test. And if I pass, you will still be cold, Tyrion said, and climbed into his ridiculous northern pony and set his face toward the richer discomforts of the south. Benjen's parting was shorter. I ride, he said, and Jon understood that this was love expressed as a sentence fragment. Keep your eyes open. Learn from those who do not care for you, and do not make enemies when you can make men annoyed instead. Jon watched him go with a feeling that had the shape of an emptier room. He set his jaw and learned the names of the men who would be his brothers in a company where names get used often, because men who die young are called often while alive. He learned to sleep with a knife near because the cold cuts. He learned to eat quickly because warmth is a commodity. He learned to listen for a thing the old men did not name, which is the sound the world makes when it is not as it should be. South again, the royal party threaded river crossings like needles, stopped at an inn with a sagging roof where the beer was good enough to make men lie about it later, slept in a holdfast with a tower that leaned away from the wind as if it had been scolded and had not forgotten. At the inn at the crossroads, where stories like to intersect because it pleases them, they found 6 different kinds of gossip already waiting on stools. Sansa heard a tale about a knight who had refused to remove his helm for a king, and a woman with a missing tooth got the details wrong on purpose to see who would correct her. Joffrey dismissed the talk with a sniff and a gold coin flicked to a serving girl and a look that made her decide not to pick it up until his eyes were elsewhere. Catelyn did not come to the inn as she would have in another tale. She was in Winterfell, where the absence of Lady had torn a quiet crescent from the rhythm of the household. She walked the gods wood more often and learned to take comfort in the Hearttree's indifference. She listened when Luwin read Lisa Arryn's letter again and let its false certainty roll over her like too warm bathwater. She handled the words. My husband was murdered, the Lannisters did it. The way a woman handles a blade she will not use and cannot ignore. She took the ravens to the rookery herself sometimes and did the simple work of mixing oats and grease and meat and found that making birds eat was a kind of prayer. She thought of riding south 100 times. Each time she did not, she named the reason and put it on a shelf and looked at it. Robb watched her and stood up straighter under the look that sometimes did not land on him. Bran climbed, for climbing is how some bodies solve fear, and in this telling no hand reached out of a tower to swat him out of the sky. At the inn, Tyrion sat with his back to a wall and his face to the room, as was his habit and not because he expected trouble. He had left the wall and carried with him the taste of a sky that had not been meant for him and had made room anyway. He drank. He listened. He told a very short man's story to a very tall man and had them both laughing by the middle. He did not see Catelyn Stark because she was not there. A piece that might have been moved was left untouched on the board, and the game, which cares very little for men's preferences, altered the lines of its next moves. The Red Keep came at last like a story told too often and never fully heard. The city smelled of hot bread and fish guts and night soil and roses and sour wine and the iron tang of blood no one would own. The bells marked their entrance so the city could measure itself against the idea of a king, and men pointed with hands still damp with work and girls pointed with mouths that made the shapes of queens' names. Sansa sat up straighter because city eyes are as quick as city hands. Inside the keep, everything pretended to be carved from something more permanent than it was. Sansa learned the corridors the way she learned a song at first, following the sound because her feet could not yet remember the steps. Cersei moved through her halls as if no one else could possibly have business in them. Joffrey regained the color in his cheeks and his appetite for deriding men he would one day command. Robert shook off the road like a wet dog and demanded a feast and called for the huntmaster and mislaid his kingly vexations until morning. Morning found Ned in a chair that had belonged to men who had died and to men who had killed and to men who had simply failed to sit it properly. The hand's badge felt heavier on a road-dusted doublet. The small council gathered like a pack of different animals forced into one pen, Renly smiling like a handsome boy who had never been embarrassed by his own face. Lord Varys watching with eyes that did not blink enough to be trusted and smile lines that had seen many kinds of ruin. Pycelle breathing like a man who used air to keep time. Peter Baelish holding his amusement like a candle cupped in his hands. Ned measured them without showing the ruler. He listened to Renly speak of tourneys and coin and pleasure, to Pycelle puff about the health of the realm as if the realm were a patient and he the doctor who had already decided on leeches, to Baelish suggest ways to pay for the king's new impetuous expenses that sounded like humor and were debt, to Varys say very little and accomplish much with it. "We are deeply in debt to Lord Tywin," Baelish observed, seeming delighted by numbers that should have made him blanch. "And the marriage of your fair daughter to the prince will require new festivities. A modest tourney, perhaps, to celebrate the royal union. 50,000 dragons for the purse would not be ungenerous." 50, Ned began, and then stopped because expressing incredulity would not change a single coin's course. "The people love a show," Renly said. He was beautiful when he smiled. It had not yet been turned into a blade. "They have had little enough of late that is not taxes and rain." "The people love bread," Ned said. "And peace." "Bread is dull," Baelish said cheerfully. "Peace is invisible. Banners are legible at great distance." "We will not feed banners to children," Ned said. He kept his voice even, because it is a cruelty to raise it when lesser men must go on speaking after you. "We will see the accounts. We will pay what we owe. And if there is to be a tourney to celebrate the binding of houses that ought not have forgotten they were friends, it will be sized to what we can truly afford. Songs can be sung without gold. I have heard them." Baelish bowed as if the game had just become more interesting. Varys smiled and watched the place where Ned's hand rested on the table. Pycelle wheezed. Renly shrugged and agreed quickly, because agreement made men like him more and cost him nothing. After, Ned went to Pycelle's tower and asked about Jon Arryn, a man dead and stubbornly present. He stood in a room that smelled of old paper and mint and resignation, and heard the maester describe a sickness that had crept, and a final word said under a wife's ear that had been the name of a book. "The seed is strong," Pycelle recalled, gazing into a memory that he had polished for visitors until it held his face better than it had held Jon Arryn's. "What did he read last?" Ned asked, because sometimes a man lives in what he looks at most. "Ah," Pycelle said, and produced a book so dull it seemed a joke. Lineages and histories of the great houses of the Seven Kingdoms, with the snobbish attention to bastardy that made men of certain tempers salivate. Ned carried it, because carrying such a weight was a form of respect for a dead man's final hour. He opened it in the quiet of his chambers and felt his eyes run lines they did not wish to run. He read color, black of hair or gold or chestnut, as if the kingdom were a garden planted to one gardener's taste. He read it again. He put his finger to a name, and then to another, and to another, as if touching them would make them confess. He felt a thought begin to form with the slowness of ice. It had the purity ice has, and the danger. Jory Castle came and went with reports and loyalty. He learned the city. He learned where the guards who wore the wrong colors liked to drink, and where the men who would hold a knife for a copper doubled that coin for a gold cloak. He found Tobo Mott's forge and marked the heat as respectable. He told Ned of a boy with black hair and blue eyes and a face that made a man's heart ache with the memory of youth who apprenticed there. Ned took that thread between his forefinger and thumb and did not pull yet. He visited Tobo and admired a blade and let the conversation go where Tobo wished so that he could see where the man thought there were stones in the river. Sansa found her own river stones. The queen liked her better silent and perfect. Court liked her better visible and lovely. She learned which ladies preferred to be called by titles and which by names. She learned that a compliment for a gown could be a declaration of war. She learned that a curtsy ever so slightly too deep was an insult. She met Tommen and Myrcella properly and discovered something that complicated everything. She liked them. Tommen's gaze had kindness in it before he chose anything else. Myrcella listened with respect rare in children. Sansa watched Joffrey neglect them in a way that felt like an injury to herself. She let Tommen pet a spaniel that belonged to a lady from the Reach who did not like dogs but liked to be seen with one when it suited. She taught Myrcella a northern song with a tune that sits close to the heart. She did not tell them about Lady, because she could not and because she did not want to let that grief be touched by soft hands. The Hound became a constant like a column in a room. He never announced himself and men announced him anyway. He watched Sansa as one watches a hearth someone else is tending. Warily, knowing that neglect as often as attention can burn a house. He never spoke to her when there were ears, and he spoke to her sometimes when there were not. "You learn fast," he said once, and turned away before she had to decide whether to take that as praise. "They will ask me to be their creature," she said, surprising herself, "because it is a dangerous thing to show an earned thought to a man who has not asked for it." "They will," he said. He scratched at his ruined face as if it itched in its sleep. "You'll be someone's creature wherever you stand. Choose the hand that holds your leash." "I would choose no leash," she said, and sounded like Arya for a breath. He snorted the way he did when laughter was too indulgent. "Girl, even kings wear leashes. Some of them tug at their own throats to feel alive." Cersei did not mind Sansa's company, which is not to say she enjoyed it. She measured the girl's distances and thought about angles and decided how to turn those into the kind of map a woman uses to march without moving. She invited Sansa to her solar and spoke of fabrics and feasts as if the exact length of a border on a sleeve had saved kingdoms. "Men die in tournaments as easily as in wars," she said while sorting through bolts of cloth with hands that remembered another kind of work. "It makes them feel brave without requiring them to be useful. Smile at the champion. Do not be too pleased with him. Champions like to think they discovered what they have just won." Sansa practiced smiling with half her mouth. She practiced standing next to Joffrey without leaning toward him. She practiced keeping her hands still when she wanted to wring them. She practiced mourning where no one could see and hiding the calmed grief where they could. At night, when she had done with being dutiful to the queen and charming to the people and useful to the idea of the North, she lay and told herself little truths as if they were prayers. Lady ran like riverlight. Father did what he had to. Arya would write one day, though she had not yet learned to spell. Joffrey could be kind if he wished it. He did not often wish. Once, near dusk, Joffrey took her hand and led her up to the tower of the Hand's roof without asking whether she minded heights. The city lay out in red and slate and smoke. The bay was tin in that light. He stood with his hair catching the last of the sun like a net. "You will be queen," he said almost softly. "I know what I am," Sansa said, attempting to make the statement as steady as a railing. "You will be queen and will have to choose who lives and dies," he said, as if he were explaining a game with rules he enjoyed. "You must learn to like the choosing. It is terrible not to like what you must do." He looked at his bandaged wrist as if it were a pet he had neglected and now remembered. "You must make those who cross you afraid. It is the only thing that works." Sansa thought of Lady's last breath, which had not been fear. "It is not the only thing," she said, and he glanced at her as if she had spoken foreign. "Love?" he said, sneering so delicately it could have been mistaken for thoughtfulness. "Love is a leash someone else holds." "Sometimes," Sansa said. "Not always." She did not say more. The sky was turning, and the first star had made itself visible, and she had no wish to test whether the prince knew how to look up. Ned moved the way a man moves when he knows his own footfalls will be counted. He found the king where a king should not be, and that was everywhere. He found Robert with a woman whose laugh had a knife in it, with a flagon that had been consorting with him too long, with a boar's tusk he had kept as a joke and then as a talisman and then as a lie. He spoke to him in the old tongue of friendship that sometimes can be heard even through wine. He brought him papers to sign and looked away when the king formed the letters with all the care of a child who knows he will be struck if he blots. He asked him to hunt less. He told him what the city cost to keep careless. He spoke of Aaron. He touched once only for the smallest moment on the queen. Robert would not hear her name without making it either a jest or an absence. "We were happy enough once," he said, which is what men say when they have decided the best part of their lives happened somewhere stranger than their own houses. Then the children came and brought her father with them, and gold set rules. "I am not made for rules." "You are made for keeping them," Ned said, "or the men who break them will become the rules." Robert laughed, delighted when someone said something worth laughing at that hurt him.
"Guts, Ned."
"Before you came to the capital, it was almost possible to pretend the world was simple. Now you bring the North into it." "The North has never left," Ned said. He let that sit. He asked again about Aaron. Robert's face closed like a fist and then opened again slowly. "He was asking questions," he admitted. "About me, about my line, about heirs, about—" He waved a hand. "Things that are not his business." "Whose are they?" Ned asked, and the king did not answer. Jory and his men followed the city's veins and learned its secret heartbeats. They came back to Ned with names and with places where those names could be found, and with the feeling that men get when they are being watched by someone who wants their attention directed elsewhere. Ned went to a certain armorer and saw a boy, handsome with that hard northern black hair that does not politely fade into brown, hammering with the concentration that makes anything done with the hand beautiful to witness. Ned spoke to him gently as to a son and asked after his mother. The boy answered with a small guarded pride and said she was dead and smiled when Ned praised his work. Ned left with his heart making shapes it did not like. He held the book Pycelle had given him again that night and read the words that did not change though his understanding of them did. A raven came to Winterfell one dusk and made noise in the rookery until Maester Luwin's hands settled it and the letter it had carried, which had a seal Luwin did not like. Catelyn sat on the bench near the hearth with the boys' game of Cyvasse left unplayed on the table and listened while Luwin read aloud a warning dressed as confession. Lisa wrote, the letters tight and frantic, that the Lannisters had poisoned Jon Arryn. She urged Catelyn to take no Lannister into her house and to pull the North up like a collar against its throat. Catelyn held the paper as if heat would show a different message beneath. She thought of Sansa at a queen's elbow and remembered how the queen had looked at her daughter at the wedding, the appraisal without affection. She stood, and the movement told Robb all he needed to know about what would happen next. "I ride south," she said. "I will not let letters talk to my husband in my place." Robb wanted to go with her. There are moments when a son wishes to be his mother's sword. "You cannot go alone," he said. "Not on the King's Road in this time." "I am not alone," she said, and said the name like an answer. "Ser Rodrik will ride with me." Rodrik Castle's whiskers had not seen the south in years. They wagged when he agreed to ride as if they had their own opinion, and it was delighted. He sharpened his blade and took his cloak and said goodbye to the gods, with the way some men say goodbye to a woman they have not told the truth. They left with 2 men more because the road is a thing to be respectful toward. They left a house that had learned how to spread itself thin, so that the absence of a wife and lord at once would not make the stones groan. Catelyn's ride south did not intersect with Tyrion's return. Not this time, but it intersected with gossip like bees around a spilt jar. At the inn at the crossroads, the toothless woman had a new story about a wolf that killed a prince and a father who cut off his own hand to placate a queen. Catelyn listened and corrected nothing. She went to her room and sat and worked the letters in Lisa's warning with a needle until the wax came up like scab and spoiled the seal. She learned nothing new. Ser Rodrik snored like a winter storm. In the morning, Catelyn's resolve felt like a blade that has been whetted too often and will cut before it gets to work if the wielder is careless. Ned and Catelyn met in a room that had seen much plotting and little loving. They did not touch much. They spoke quickly, because time is an enemy in King's Landing. She gave him the letter, and he read it and let Varys' shadow pass behind his eyes and allowed himself to say Cersei's name without spitting. He told her about the book and about the boy and about the way the queen watched him as if weighing him for a crate. She told him about Winterfell's quiet and about Robb's new straight shoulders and about how the gods would felt different after a direwolf had died for a lesson. "We must be careful," she said. "We must be careful and quick. We can be one or the other," Ned said with a grimness that had nothing of humor. "The city will not tolerate both." He did not ask her to stay because he was not a man who made a wife sit where she did not wish to. He did not ask her to leave because he needed her to want it. She wanted to be gone in the way women sometimes want to be gone from a palace, which is to say not from a person but from the air. She left. She rode with Rodrik away into a story that could have become another story entirely if, say, a certain dwarf had been short of a horse that day. He was not. The road is not generous. It is obedient. In the Red Keep, Varys and Littlefinger spoke with the casual intimacy of men whose battles are fought in sentences. "Lady Stark comes and goes," Varys observed, as if charting a bird's migration. "How very brave. "How very rash," Peter said, as if rashness were a compliment given to women he had once wanted. "We could have made hay of that. Opportunity used to knock louder." "Perhaps the knocks are not meant for us," Varys said, smiling a smile that had no teeth. "Or perhaps we are to listen through the door." "I prefer to open it," Littlefinger said, and considered whether Sansa's marriage made her more or less useful than she had been when she was merely beautiful and possible. Cersei read a different book than Ned's, a book in which the chapters were men's hearts. She watched Joffrey grow more certain in the wrong ways and tried to make him certain in the right ones by telling him stories in which kindness had been a trap and softness a dagger. She did not believe what she said exactly. She believed that men are treacherous and that treachery respects force and machination and expects anything softer to be a mask. She showed Joffrey women who smiled and men who smiled and taught him to count teeth behind the lips. He learned, but he learned to count others' teeth and not his own. He did not see the hound's tired disgust or Sansa's patience as arts. He saw them as weakness and armor respectively and despised one and planned to dent the other. He struck a serving boy once who had spilled wine and watched Sansa from the corner of his eye as if she were a mirror he trusted to tell him whether he had made the right choice. Sansa did not flinch. She said the boy should be given a clean cloth. Later she found the boy and gave him a clean cloth and told him to keep it. She did not tell him to keep a memory. He would anyway. The days filled with tasks that were not large enough to be called plot and not small enough to ignore. Letters were answered and intercepted and misdelivered. The royal hawks grew sulky and required a man who understood the moods of birds better than of men. A ship from Bravos arrived with bolts of cloth that would make ladies from the Reach sigh and made northern ladies bristle. A septon preached a sermon in which he named mercy the crown of justice and caused the queen to pick at a thread on her sleeve. A cut purse lost 3 fingers in the market and Varys had them counted. Sansa attended a supper where a lord from Duskendale spoke only of the sea even when asked about hounds. She sat near a lady from the Vale who had had 6 daughters and no sons and watched how the woman held her mouth as if to keep the 7th daughter from leaving it. She marked, too, the way Lord Renly's eyes moved when the king laughed. Quick, assessing, affection and exasperation braided. And the way Lord Stannis was spoken of in that city with a faint wrinkle of disdain as if duty were an odor. On an afternoon pretending to be spring, Ned met with Renly in a gallery open to potted lemon trees that tried to turn sour into sunlight. Renly wanted to be liked more than he wanted to be good, which is a vice men forgive when the face is fair. He spoke of Stannis with a brother's irritable love and of Robert with a brother's fear disguised as irritation. He asked Sansa, politely and with a handsomeness that made the question sound better than it was, how she found the city, and she answered with a practiced brightness that did not fool him entirely. After, he told Ned a story about a gold cloak who had thought it wise to insult Loras Tyrell in a place where Loras could not reply and had found a flower pinned to his door the next morning that wilted in an hour. It was meant to be witty and ominous both. Ned filed it where such things belonged. Ned's steps carried him to a place where he could look down on the training yard. He watched men hit each other to learn not to be killed by other men. And he watched a boy with a tight jaw called Jack slam his shoulder into a larger boy's chest and then fall hard because he had not kept his feet under him. He watched the hound survey the yard with the calm of a man who knows he will never be surprised by men hurting each other. He watched Arya there, too, because she had found the yard as water finds a low place and had made a bargain with a bravo from Bravos who called himself Syrio Farrell and moved like an answer to a question no one else had asked. Ned watched the thin man teach his thin daughter to dance, and he did not stop it because no one can stop a river by lecturing it. Left foot leads, Syrio said. Always the truth buried under lies. Find the truth. Sugar to make sweet, but you need bread. Arya took the correction as she took the wind, as something that would be there whether she liked it or not, so she might as well learn to turn her face at the right angle. She loved the cane that struck her when she was wrong because it told the truth. She loved, too, the way her body remembered when her mind forgot. She did not tell Sansa much about the lessons because Sansa's sadness had become a thing to be careful around, like a bruise on a fruit that can be eaten still if you cut it rightly. The tourney came because weak men love to give strong men games to play while the accounts are settled. Ned fought the size down. The purse was insultingly modest to those who would have called it sportier, with another 10,000 dragons thrown in. It was an outrageous waste to men who expected peace to spend thriftily. He failed to cancel it. He succeeded in making it smaller. Robert laughed and bet on men whose names his steward provided. Renly preened in green and drew eyes. Littlefinger added sums with his tongue and looked pleased. Varys watched the faces in the crowd and did not applaud. The Hound withdrew his helm with impatience and looked no different without it. Ser Gregor rode and made other men understand that size matters when a man chooses not to be human. In the child's ranges, boys knocked each other down and learned the sound of their own bones. Sansa watched with the face she had practiced and allowed herself to be delighted when it cost little and to be impressed when it cost less. She clapped for a man from the Stormlands who unfurled a banner that looked like rain and rode like it and fell like it too. She smiled at Myrcella when the girl gasped and started to cry at a bloodied nose and then laughed at herself for crying. She did not look at Joffrey when the Hound entered the lists to prove a point. She did not look when the Mountain unhorsed a man with a contempt that made men around him clench their thighs in sympathy. She looked at the sky and found it too bright. She looked at her hands and found them too still. That night she lay very straight in her bed and listened to the city hum beneath her, and to a night bird call, and to the sound of Arya's feet scuffing out later than they should have. She thought of Lady no longer and of Lady always. She thought of a green place by a river, and of a boy with a stick, and of a prince with a wound that would become a story, and of a father who had made himself a blade to keep his daughter from being a lesson. She thought of the old gods and of the seven, whose faces were not hers, and of the way light behaves when it goes through stained glass and becomes an argument for softening. Ned kept reading. He kept visiting. He kept walking into rooms where men thought they had prepared what he would see and picking up different things. He went to a brothel where a woman ran her house as a better-dressed maester might, and found there a child with hair blacker than coal and eyes like the winter sky after snow, and saw in that face a truth a book had murmured at him. He left silver that could purchase a clean exit for a woman who had already purchased what exits she could. He told her nothing of what he knew. He left and stood in the sun again and closed his eyes and told himself at last what the words had been trying to tell him. Seed is strong. Hair tells tales. Some children do not inherit what they are meant to inherit, and some inherit what cannot be explained by polite stories. He saw, and he wished he had not. He thought of Robert and felt a weight one friend should not have to drop on another's breast. Cersei saw him see. She could not have prevented it forever. She measured how much time she had and counted it differently than Ned did. She moved Joffrey toward Sansa and Sansa toward Joffrey with a slow increased pressure that felt like sunlight at noon to anyone who enjoyed it and like a brand to anyone who did not. She instructed Pycelle to speak to her in rooms where Varys could not pretend he was not listening. She told Jaime nothing and everything with a look. She began to write letters she would not have had to write in another telling. Joffrey came to Sansa one evening in a temper that was not theatrical and spoke to her as if she were already queen and already his, which in some ways she was. He told her she would be presented to the people with him in the sept, and that she should be certain to look devout without appearing to enjoy it, and that she would wear blue because he would wear black and the contrast would make them more beautiful. He said this with the assumption that he need not ask. She said yes, and she chose a blue that was not the one he had named because she liked it better. He did not notice. In the sept, the candles gleamed with the slightly poisonous richness they always have when too many are lit at once. The stranger's face gazed down with its empty promise. The crone's light fell where it pleased and where it could be lit. Sansa bent and stood and bent again with a grace that pleased even those who remembered not to be pleased by anything that came from the north. Joffrey led her where he had been told to lead her. The queen watched. Lord Varys bowed his bald head and spoke a prayer no one heard. Ned stood at the edge of light and considered again whether any gods in this city could hear a northern oath. When they left the sept, a man shouted. It was not much of a shout. It was an overfull heart spilling. He shouted that the king was a stag grown fat on his people, and that the queen was a whore, and that the prince was a boy made of paint, and that a wolf had more honor than all three. The guards moved at once as if the shout had been a thrown knife. Joffrey's face altered and became ugly. Sansa felt a hand on her sleeve and only later understood it belonged to the Hound, who moved her without making it look like this had been done to a lady. The man who had shouted was dragged and struck and dragged again, and a woman cried out for him, and no one answered a woman. Ned's jaw went hard. Robert was not there to decide. The queen was, and she did. "Do not let the mob think this is easy," Cersei said, and that was the end of the man. Sansa looked back once and saw only the idea of blood on the stones like a spilled measure of wine. She did not tell herself that the man had been wrong. She did not tell herself he had been right. She told herself nothing. She fixed her eyes on the hill's slope and walked without catching her foot. At home that night, she and Arya fought because sisters fight when they are afraid of bigger things. Arya accused her of loving Joffrey for his hair. Sansa accused Arya of loving nothing but her wolf. The words were unfair and the girls knew it. They slept on their backs far away on their pallets. And in the morning they both remembered they had meant love and made it into weapons because they had no iron to hand. Sansa touched Arya's wrist while they broke their fast and did not apologize. Arya did not pull away, which was apology enough. By then, Ned had decided what he would say to the king. He did not plan the speech with words so much as with breath. He did not like to tell men news that would break their lives. No decent man does. But he had always believed that telling a truth before it rotted was kindness. He asked that the king meet him alone, and the king did not. He came with wine and with an ungentle appetite for avoidance. They stood in a room that smelled of old hunting trophies and oil and the sweat of guards and talked. And Robert dodged and jested and grew angry and grew embarrassed and then was called away by a need for meat. Ned watched him go and calculated a different hour. He found Cersei instead, by accident that had been arranged by someone. She stood in a garden where the lemon trees had given up pretending to be happy and smelled of a country she had never truly seen. They spoke without smiling. He told her what he knew in the plain way a northern man tells a southern woman bad news. She told him he was an honorable man in a way that let the word be an insult. He told her to take her children and run before Robert returned from hunting with the need to make the world clear again. She told him that mercy was salt on a wound and that he had offered her both too late. "Why is it that the truth is always late to men like you?" she asked, and the question had a sting he deserved. "Because we stay to hear the rest of the lies," Ned said, and she took that, storing it perhaps for the next man. When he left her, the city felt thinner. He went to his rooms and wrote a letter. He sealed it. He did not send it. He sent another in its place that said less. He sent Jory to tell men to keep their hands near their hilts. He told Sansa nothing, because the kind thing would have been to tell her everything, and he had not the heart to be kind in that way. She found him at the door as he crossed, and he put his hand to her hair and said only, "Be careful." And she said, "Always," because she had learned to lie when it saved people. On the Trident, men in a different story broke bread and swore oaths, and a boar nosed at a root and decided to move elsewhere, and someone who had never been to court lost a hand in a mill and did not die, and in Dragonstone Stannis sat with a candle and did not write the letter he should have written, and at the wall Jon stood a watch and told himself that the night held only stars and wind, and that the other things were stories to make young men stand straighter than their spines would permit. The royal hunt went out with horns and dogs and laughter. Men who loved the king in the way men love something that once made them feel 12 again went with him. The hound went. Renly went with bright cloth under his leather. The king went with a jug of confidence. He returned with a wound that had allowed itself to be given by a pig he had paid someone to fatten and not watch. He returned green with pain and rage and shame. The city went quiet the way a wife goes quiet when a husband comes home drunk. Cersei took control the way a woman does when a man's pretense of control finally collapses under its own weight. Ned was called to a bedside that smelled of blood and wine and defeat, and he stood where boys stand by fathers and took a last order that would be written differently on a parchment and read differently by a queen. He watched Robert conduct his own absolution with the confidence of a man who has never been depressed by his own sins for long. He watched him die as if he had known all along he would go out of the world the way he came into it. Too loud, too sudden, too beloved by those he did not deserve. He took the paper and the words that named him protector and put them where he put truly heavy things, in his left hand, and decided to do the right thing and save a country from a lie. Sansa did not know any of this yet. She knew only that the city had a new sound underneath its usual hum, like a kettle about to boil. She knew Joffrey had sent for her and that the queen had sent for her separately, as if to teach her that there would be many rooms now where she would be asked to stand at 2 windows and look out of both. She prepared. She chose the blue the prince had liked before. She practiced not smoothing the front of her dress where ladies' hair would have been sometimes. She told herself that she would make her father proud by being very still and very brave and very obedient where it cost her little and very disobedient where it cost her no one else anything. She told herself that the story about the wolf and the prince would fade like a scar if it was not picked at. Arya knew something else. Syrio had tapped her wrists and made her step and step again, and then he had put his stick down and looked at the door as if it were a mouth. He had told her very softly to leave. He had told her that men would come who would call her name and that she should not answer because names are handles and she was not a pot to be grasped. He had told her to remember the step where you slide under a man's arm and become the wind. She had laughed at the poetry until she had tried it and realized there is nothing more practical than a metaphor when a sword is coming down. She took needle from under a slab where she kept it when she had to pretend she did not own it. She went out by a door that was meant for a different sort of servant. She looked down and did not look back. The city tipped. It does that when a king dies. The ground shifts like a stage built in a hurry. Ned went to the throne room with papers and with honor and with the last piece of certainty he would allow himself, which was that he could save children from what men do when they argue about crowns. Cersei arrived with her children and her guards and her father's money and her certainty, which was of a different kind. Joffrey sat where he had not earned the right to sit and looked at Sansa the way a boy looks at a toy he is not yet sure how to break. Sansa looked at him and saw that he did not know he had broken a thing already inside himself, and that knowledge felt like fate. Ned spoke plainly in a room that rewards different music. Men drew steel.
Swordsrang.
A paper was torn because paper is always what is torn first, and men pretend it matters while they cut throats. Sansa watched with a calm that had been nailed in place. She remembered the moment in the river meadow when Lady had looked at her and known what her girl would become. She said nothing. She burned the sight on her heart. The hound stood where he had been told to stand and then moved where he had decided he must, because there are orders and there are the things a man cannot abide. He watched Sansa, not because she would be a queen or because she was from the north, but because he had put a hand on her sleeve once and she had let him move her without shrinking from his face. He did not fight for her. He merely failed to do a thing that would have hurt her. It amounted to the same. By day's end, the city knew it had a boy for a king and a woman for a regent and a man for a traitor and another man who would be protector of nothing if he was allowed to keep the breath in his chest long enough to regret it. Sansa learned how quickly rooms can be rearranged to keep a girl from the other rooms. She learned that kindness becomes contraband at such times and that a septa can cry with her mouth shut. She learned that letters can become chains. She went to the queen because she had been told to, and Cersei looked on her like a woman considering whether to keep a gem or throw it into a river for the pleasure of hearing it plunk. "You will keep your mouth shut," the queen said, and Sansa, who had kept it shut through worse things than this, inclined her head. "You will write to your brother with a sweet voice and ask him to come to court and kneel to your sweet husband and make the North obedient." "I will write to my family," Sansa said, and could not help watching the word sweet turn ash-gray. "You will write what I say," Cersei returned, "and if you do not, I will teach you that wolves are not the only creatures that can be hunted." Sansa thought of Lady again, but now she thought of what comes after the blow. The quiet, the need for water, the hands that lift the body. "I will write," she said. "I will ask them to come." Arya went not north yet because the city is a maze and because freedom needs names and documents as much as it needs courage. She hid and learned how to be small, which is the saddest and sharpest of her lessons. She learned to follow the smell of onions to a door that would let a child out of a slaughterhouse and into a street. She learned to breathe shallow when men walked by who would enjoy catching a girl like a bird. She learned to be water where men expected wood. She lost a piece of herself the size of a cup and found a piece the size of a blade. Ned was taken where all men are taken when a city decides to enjoy its power. He stood straight and took his food and spoke to his guards as if they were men. He wrote a letter and did not send it. He wrote another and burned it. He thought of the north where the gods do not watch but endure, and he thought of Sansa's small white gloves and of Arya's bare feet and of the way Robb had stood at the gate with a look like a man who would stay unless told not to. He did not think of Cersei except as a problem solved by truth and mercy offered too late. He thought of Robert and decided to forgive him where that cost him nothing, which is to say where it cost him everything. In Winterfell, Robb read a letter that asked him to come and kneel. He looked at the Godswood and at the place where Lady would have lain and at his mother's empty chair and at the men who waited for a boy to become a man because history requires it. He knelt to the old gods and to his father's choices and stood with a face that seemed too young for what it must bear. He sent ravens not with sweet voices but with plain words. He called his banners because there was nothing else to call if he kept his name. He whispered Sansa's name into the night and did not weep. He told Bran to sleep. He told Theon to be useful, and Theon laughed and said he always was. He told Grey Wind, who had grown too suddenly into the shape the North had always intended for him, to guard the walls. Grey Wind blinked once and went to stand where the air came in from the moors. At the wall, Jon learned of kings and kept his watch. Ghost stood with him in the frost that had sharpened. A raven said a word that sounded like king and then like kill and then like corn, because birds know what they know and are not bound to men's meanings. Jon felt the North pull at him harder than any cloak and gripped the stones until his hands hurt. He thought of Sansa and of Arya and of his father and of a world where he would go south to be a son instead of north to be a brother. He kept his feet where his oath had planted them, because there is a kind of man who learns to love the pain of doing what is right just for the shape it makes in his chest. In King's Landing, summer rotted faster than usual. Heat came and did not keep accounts. Flies wrote their own laws. The queen sat with her son and taught him to put his hand backward on the arm of the chair like a king and to speak sentences that had more edges than a normal boy should be trusted with. Sansa learned to be within reach and just out of hand. The hound watched and smoked and swore and stood between her and some things with such casual timing that she did not notice until later that she had not been cut. Men made plans, and plans made corpses, and corpses made stories, and stories made plans again. The game moved its pieces and did not ask them. Sansa wrote a letter and made it sound like something the queen would like to read. She made an extra copy in her head that had no ink and sent it north by closing her eyes and saying Robb's name where her heart could hear it. She did not know if such letters arrive. She did it anyway. She walked to a window and looked out at a city that did not love her and saw how beautiful it was when the last light puts gold on things that do not deserve it. She put her hand to her throat and felt it beat. And she told herself a story not about queens or wolves or kings or hunts or seeds or books, but about a girl who did not always say yes when the world asked her to. She told it once and then again and again until the story felt true enough to be dangerous. The city breathed in a different rhythm after the paper tore. The corridors learned how to swallow footsteps. The windows forgot how to make light feel welcome. Men carried news as if it were fire. No voice rose above another for long. The Red Keep contracted around itself like a wounded animal. In that shutting, Sansa found herself moved and moved again, like a painted saint born by acolytes who did not care for the miracle. Her chamber was a room she had never seen, door heavy, window small, the bed too large for the sleep she could not catch. Septa Mordane came and went with a measured calm that had acquired a tremor in its bones. The queen's women came with dresses and a spool of language that did not require answers. The hound stood outside her door, or he could not be seen and was near anyway. She learned his stillnesses. He did not speak when there were voices already filling the spaces. He did not look at her with pity, which would have robbed her of the thing she had saved for herself, the right to suffer in her own way. When he did speak, he said what a knife would say if knives told the truth. "You're safe here," he said once. A lie told to a child to make her sleep, except there was no softness in it. Insofar as anyone is safe. You know what that means? It means the room is smaller, she said, surprising herself. He grunted and turned his head and watched a tapestry as if it might choose to catch fire, and that was the end of the lesson. The queen sent for Sansa the day men began to kneel to the wrong boy. The throne room smelt of oil and iron, and the breath of a crowd held too long. Sansa was brought like a guest no one intended to amuse. She curtsied before the throne as she had been taught. She did not look at the sword made of swords shaped like a story about men who thought sitting should hurt. Joffrey wore the crown as if it had been his skull all along. The light found his hair and made it boast. Cersei stood beside him like a beautifully armed arm. The little council stood below and to the side and had arranged their faces to appear useful and innocent at once. "Your husband would hear you," Cersei said, and that was one of the day's cruelties. How easily the word husband could be used as a bridle. Sansa stepped forward without stumbling and stood where the queen's hand had indicated, though it had not pointed. Her eyes flicked once to the place where her father had stood 2 days earlier, when paper had been a shield and friendship a wound. "Your Grace," she said to Joffrey, "and let the words be perfectly clear. I beg the king be merciful. My father, Lord Eddard, spoke only in love for your house. He wished only to protect you and your brother and sister. He has always said that a king's life is a light that must be kept. If he was mistaken, he will say so. He will say so before all. Grant him grace, and he will love you for it." She had rehearsed that part. Cost her less than the next. "I will love you for it." She let her eyes stay soft on his, and she hated herself a little for that and kept them soft anyway. Joffrey took the words into his mouth as a tester tastes wine. Suspicious and eager and ready to spit. He liked how they felt. He liked more how her voice sounded when it called him king, as if the air itself would be punished if it had called him anything else. He leaned back as if to admire her from a greater distance. "A traitor's daughter begs for a traitor," he said, with a young man's wonder at his own sentence. He glanced at Cersei, and her eyes told him nothing he had not already decided. "If your father loves me, he will confess his treason. If he does, I will be merciful." He paused, savoring the word. "The gods are merciful. I am their instrument." Cersei's hand moved the tiniest amount, as if to arrest a falling drop of something before it could stain. "His grace speaks wisely," she said. "If Lord Stark confesses his crimes and declares his guilt and asks pardon of his king, his grace will be moved to mercy. Mercy is the mark of a good king." Her glance took in the gathered lords, and they nodded as if she had explained something mathematical. "What mercy?" Sansa asked, because if she did not learn the price now, she would not be able to clutch the coin later. Cersei smiled the way an officer smiles at a private who has asked something sensible. "The mercy of life. The king will not take your father's head. He will be allowed to live, though the wall may be the only place large enough for him." The words were thrown lightly, as if the wall were a phrase and not a frozen oath. "You will write to your brother. Ask him to bring the northern swords to the king's peace." "I will write," Sansa said. The room tilted and righted. She had meant to be braver than this, to argue for freedom and honor and softness and all those valiant things that are beautiful in songs. But the words mercy and life had laid down like warm animals at her feet. She stepped over them and went where they compelled her to go. "I will go to the September and pray to the mother that my father be allowed to confess." Joffrey smiled with half his mouth. That had become his best trick. "Let us not trouble the gods. I will tell the Septon what to say. He can repeat it to his gods. We will show the realm that traitors are forgiven when they are small and confess. We will show them a king's strength. He loved already that strength could be confused with spectacle. We will do it at Baelor's September. The bells will ring. All King's Landing will come." Cersei inclined her head, hiding a flicker of irritation. She had intended a quieter humiliation. She would now make a louder lesson. She placed a hand on Sansa's forearm and left it there just long enough to measure a pulse. "You will be there, of course," she said, making of the invitation a kind of oath. Sansa bowed and allowed herself to be led away. She walked from that hall thinking not of honor, which had become too abstract to be useful, but of breath and bone. She found Septa Mordain waiting in her chamber and let the older woman lay hands on her hair and make it do things hair does when it is instructed by patience. "I will pray," the septa said, and Sansa did not tell her that the king had arranged with the gods what the gods must hear. In the dark near the bottom of the Red Keep, Ned Stark counted the mortar lines between stones until the numbers made a pattern he could own. It is a way men keep themselves from thinking they should beg. He had been a boy once, and then he had been something else ever since he learned that men die who shouldn't, and that's what the world is. A ledger that will not balance because it is not meant to. The cell smelled of damp and old straw and the low tang of the sea that got into everything given long enough. He slept in short hard drops. He woke with a clarity that hurt. Varys came with the whisper of silk and the sincerity a man wears who has learned to be believed in proportion to how softly he speaks. The torch he brought made the walls feel closer. He examined Ned's face as if it were a letter someone else had sealed badly. "Lord Stark," he said, with that precise sorrow that never smudged anything. "The city is a creature that eats faster than decent men can cook. Forgive it. Forgive me. Forgive yourself, if there is still time to be of any use." He held up a small flagon and poured water into a chipped cup. "Drink. You must prepare to tell a story." Ned's smile, when it came, was almost polite. "You have always loved a story." "I love outcomes," Varys said. "Stories are the only way to steer men toward them. The queen wants your head. The boy wants your submission. The realm wants bread and quiet. The girl, your girl, wants her father. I want balance." He offered the cup. "Drink what there is. It is not poisoned. Poison is for men who cannot be contained in a cell." Ned drank. Cold, a relief he allowed. "You could have done many other things." "Yes," Varys said. "I do many things. For now, do this: live. Confess to a crime you did not commit. Tell the truth about the wrong lie. Save your daughters. Later, perhaps, you may learn that living to spite one's foes is its own form of honor." "You ask me to yield my name," Ned said, but the words did not have the heat he had imagined when he was younger. He thought of Sansa's small hand, of Arya's stubborn chin, of Robb's straightening shoulders, of Jon's eyes hungry for a horizon that would not be kind. He thought of the heads of men lined on pikes because other men had made a point. He let the thought of the wall arrive and sit. "If I say I lied, the lie becomes true in other mouths." "It already is," Varys said, kindness coiled in the observation. "Do not protest that the world should not be so. The world is so. The king is a boy whom his mother has raised to love the lash more than the law. I will not tell you to trust me. I will tell you that the girl Sansa wrote to her brother this morning with a voice borrowed from the queen. If the north comes, the river will run the wrong color. If you live, you may soften what follows. If you die, all you have taught them will become something else. Fury, perhaps. Fury is hard to contain once it has found itself justified." Ned closed his eyes because it made the room simpler. "The old gods have no faces here," he said. "It is difficult to ask favors of a tree that is not present." When he opened them again, Varys had lowered his gaze to look properly penitent. "Tell the queen I will say what she requires," Ned said, and the words were heavier than any sword he had lifted. "Tell her I will speak it where all can hear. Tell her to keep my daughters whole." "They will be used," Varys said, because honesty was the better metal with which to forge this tool. "But I will do what I can. The Hound, perhaps, the only man of hers who sometimes enjoys disobedience. We learn to choose strange friends." He rose without rustling and went to the door and put his ear to it with theatrical caution. "If there were gods to be prayed to hear, I would pray to one that known truths did not ruin the world so readily." "I will speak," Ned said again, and Varys inclined his head as if he were receiving a gift. Arya's day had been an examination written in a script that moved too quickly. Syrio Farrell's reed had made a sound as it struck a Kingsguard's helm that she would hear again on nights she could not sleep. "What do we say to the god of death?" he had asked, as if the question were necessary at all. "Not today," she had said, and the words had done a thing to her spine she had not known words could do. Later, she would remember the last strike that had cracked the man's helm and blood coming out in a surprising arc that seemed to contradict the idea of water finding its level. and how Syrio had smiled at her even while not looking at her at all, and how he had told her to go and not return and not be foolish, and she had done none of the three exactly. She ran. She ran because there were men coming to be thorough in an unkind way. She ran because running is sometimes the most complicated thing a person can do. She knew 3 back stairways. She used 2. At the bottom of the second, she found a stable boy who had never seen her before and who saw only a thin little thief and an opportunity to be of use to the wrong man, and gave a shout that would have made a different Arya stop to say something cruel. This Arya had a sword. Needle found a home under his ribs as easily as if a tailor had been sent to take his measure in the womb. He made a sound that was not very loud. He died as if the floor were a bed he had been promised. Arya stood over the boy, a long heartbeat. She stared at the hilt as if it belonged to someone else, and then at the streak of red on the blade that did not look like the painted red on a Tyroshi sail. She thought, "This is the first." She did not know what thought would follow. Then the thought did come. He would have shouted again. She had done what Syrio had taught: be water, get small, slide under the blade. She moved again. She skittered through a door where a thrush hopped in and out and found herself in a place where grain was kept. She crawled into it and listened to men's voices say things about wolves and daughters and traitors. She kept the grain from making her sneeze. She slept there at last, mouth dry, eyes open. Yoren found her because he listened to the world, and because at the end of a long road up and down the King's Road, he had come to know what kind of sound a hunted child makes trying to be grain. He shook her the way a man shakes someone he would rather not shake because he knows it will hurt both. "Boy," he said, because in that moment she must be boy or she would be dead. He drew a knife and saw her eyes flash and nearly laughed at himself for the blasphemy of cutting a small girl's hair in a god's great house. He cut anyway, sawing with the impatient gentleness men use for knots too tight for their thumbs. Ash! He tossed the hair into the grain because he had learned to throw a thing where his pursuers would not think to look. "Come," he said. "Come quick. There's no more Syrio for you. Your father will meet you where all men meet if you get yourself killed before I get you north." Arya went with him without trusting him because she had learned that trust is a luxury a girl cannot afford and still buy food. He showed her a door that had forgotten being a door once and remembered it long enough to slide. He taught her to spit and to hold herself like a boy. He put her with a tangle of men in black and boys who would be men in black if they lived, and he told her to look at the road and not back. "If you look back," he said, "you'll see something that makes you turn around, and that will be the end of it." She did not look back. Not until she was on the King's Road itself, and then she cheated. She looked a little. The city was a shape against the flat sky, and the sea beyond it was a metal she had not learned the name of. She put the thing she had learned, what it feels like to put a sword into a person, inside her shirt like a stone, and hoped it would not bruise too much. Sansa wrote letters that pleased the queen, and a letter she did not write. She sat at a table in a small room with a narrow window, and the window showed the fragment of the bay that had learned to pretend it was not ugly, and Septa Mordane's lips moved as she prayed, and Sansa chose words the queen's steward had approved and dipped the quill in ink and made the loops neat. "Rob," she began, and that first word cost her more than any other because she knew that every word after it would be fake if that one had been true. She asked him to come to court and kneel and bring his men to prove they were not enemies. She pressed down too hard on bring, and ink bled a little. She signed her name as the Queen's woman had suggested. Sansa of House Baratheon Stark, Princess. It looked a little like a cut. In Winterfell, Rob read the letter and did not read the letter. He heard the words Sansa had not been allowed to write. He felt the treasures of his childhood. His sister's laugh, the smell of wet dog after a hunt, the improbably proud tilt of Jon's jaw when Ser Roderick praised him. Being moved into a different room without asking him. He did not sit long. He called Maester Luwin and Theon and the great Jon and men whose names he had heard all his life and who now looked at him with hunger that was not unkind. He did not raise his voice. He ordered food for guests who would ride in bad weather and called banners that had never been tested in his lifetime, and told the smith to work and told the kennel master to keep the hounds from sensing what the men were feeling. He went alone to the godswood and put his hand on the cold heart tree, and it did not answer him, which is how the old gods speak. Catelyn felt the air change on the road north and cut toward Riverrun as if a magnet had been set under the earth. She had left King's Landing with Ser Roderick and 2 men, and they had meant to go straight home. But news travels along the road like a disease, and the first fevered voice told her the king had died, and the second told her the queen had taken the room, and the third told her men had been killed in the throne room and a northerner had been led away, and then the stories blurred, and then she did not ask. She knew where she could do some good that was not prayer. She turned her horse west. Ser Roderick did not argue. He adjusted the strap on his saddle in that way he had when he was thinking too many thoughts for his whiskers. "Your father will want you," he said, and they both pretended that was the only reason. Lord Hoster Tully lay with the river in his lungs and his daughter's hand very gentle on his wrist. Riverruns Hall still made the long sound of men arriving and women ordering and bread being made in quantities that meant something serious. Catelyn did not rest. She sent ravens that asked better questions than the ones from Lisa had answered. She sat with men of the Trident and listened to their coughs as carefully as their words. She learned that Lannister men had begun to move before the paper tore, that there were banners seen near the Golden Tooth, that some of the fords had become suspiciously busy with surveyors. Tywin Lannister did not learn from letters. He taught men with them. He would call what he was doing the king's peace. The river lords called it something else, and sharpened blades around the word. Robb came down the King's Road with the North traveling with him. Karstark and Umber and Manderley and Serwyn and men whose fathers had died under a banner that had rusted and now had been polished. Grey Wind ranged and returned and ranged again and slept at the foot of Robb's bed, as if the old gods had risen up into a beast and made their own judgments each night in their sleep. Theon joked and did not sleep because the laughter cost him less than asking forgiveness he did not intend. Maester Luwin rode with a face that seemed always to be practicing a lesson. The Great John roared at a cook and at a groom and at a lord, and each roar was carefully chosen for appropriate effect. They crossed the neck with fewer curses than the South had given, because men who had learned to be poor in comforts wore their discomforts better. When Robb reached the ruins of Moat Cailin, he looked at it in silence and understood, in a way he had not as a boy, that not even stone stays loyal forever. Catelyn met Robb at the crossing where the King's Road leans into the river as though it has tired of itself. She dismounted before he was fully down and used both hands to hold his face, and then did let herself move her hands elsewhere. "The letters say one thing," she said without preamble. "Men say another. We will act on the worst because that is the only way to keep our people alive." "I will bring father home," Robb said. He spoke it as if he had called it true. His voice had lost the last of its boy echoes. In the next hour, he allowed himself 3 minutes to be a son. Then he turned and learned the river as a general learns a foreign language he will need tomorrow. In the Red Keep, a different sort of council learned a different sort of language. Baelish's mouth arranged a sentence about coin and lords reliable for loans and lords reliable for compliments. Varys set small pieces on an invisible board, the baker's gossip, the wharfman's new song. Pycelle spoke of predictable things as if they were the only things. Renly had left, his smiling sufficiency finally inadequate to the new gravity. Stannis had sent nothing, which was a message louder than letters. Cersei read from a script she had begun writing for herself when she had been 12. Joffrey practiced being a tyrant the way other boys had practiced sword forms. Awkward, earnest, hungry for applause. He liked Sansa's obedience. He needed it, as one reaches for a cup in a hand that has poured water for one all one's life. He liked her more when she sat very still and looked very careful and said, "Your Grace," like a woman given to him for a purpose he understood. He hated her when she asked anything. He could not yet tell the difference between being petitioned and being hurt. He taught himself to hurt less. He learned to humiliate men older than he was with how easily the word kneel came off his tongue. He trapped a singer whose song had made a good rhyme of bore and whore, and had him stripped and beaten until the words stuck in the boy's throat like fish bones. Sansa learned to look at him as one looks at a light that will hurt if admired too long. She asked for her father. Each time she asked, she stripped the plea of any adornment a queen might find offensive. "If my lord father will confess," she said again. "You said he may be shown mercy." Cersei made sure the arrangement held still. She sent for the High Septon and smiled at him with all 7 faces at once. and the old man lowered his eyes because men lower their eyes when the queen withholds even a gesture's worth of mercy. The day was set. Bells would ring until the sound crawled into every room and under every nail. She told Sansa she might wear blue. She told the hound he must be near the girl when the crowd pressed close. She told herself she had saved her children. She did not believe herself. She chose to admire the neatness of the script. Sansa slept badly the night before. She dreamed of a meadow and water and a boy laughing, and then the water ran red and took the laugh away with it. She woke to her own hand at her throat again. The septa was already up. She had the look of a woman who had practiced not crying for long enough that it had become almost effortless. They knelt and spoke the prayers of the mother and the maiden and the crone, though Sansa had learned that none of them speak north or south except in men's stories. She dressed herself with a care that made her hands shake less. She braided her hair with the shreds of ribbon she had not allowed anyone to take from her trunk. Ribbon that had once tied around the bread loaves when she and Arya had stolen a heel in the kitchen and laughed with their mouths full. She tied them in 2 small acts of theft against a world that liked to take openly. The square before Baelor's had become more than a square. It was a throat. People crammed into it like blood refusing to circulate. Banners climbed above heads on poles. The sky had decided to be brilliant, which was indecent. The bells pealed as if they had been hired to do it. The steps of the September rose like a lesson men had not yet learned. On those steps, a structure had been built because men love to build a small theater where they can conduct their own gods. Sansa was led to the foot of the steps, not too far from the dais set below the statue of Baelor with his long sorrow. The hound stood at her shoulder and took up space she had been given to feel less alone. Cersei stood by Joffrey. The boy king wore a black doublet that made his hair help him more than it should have done. He looked the part he had not earned, and parts sometimes convince an audience even when the actor doesn't believe his own lines. Sansa did not look for Arya. She knew better by now than to let a wish show itself on her face. They brought Ned out. He came stiffly because his body had been left too long without motion, and because pride had been asked to sit too often and resented standing. His hair had gone to grease and his beard to rag, and no part of him had forgotten that he had held a daughter's head once when she cried over a broken lace. Sansa felt the air thin and thought she would be sick and did not let her mouth shape anything but stillness. Ned looked out at the sea of faces and found his child. He did not let his eyes hold long. He looked at the High Septon, who mouthed a prayer that had been set before him without his consent. Ned Stark's voice, when it came, was not the voice of a broken man or a defiant one. It was the voice of a man who had chosen something and would bear it. He confessed. He named himself traitor. He called the boy his king. He declared that he had tried to steal a crown. He begged mercy. He looked at Sansa one more time and held that look as if it were enough meat to carry him through winter. She had thought she would faint when she heard the word traitor in his own voice. She did not. It was as if the word had been cut into her skin with a small knife, and now the bleeding had stopped and she could watch the healer stitch without screaming. She held fast. She waited for the shape of mercy to be made. The crowd murmured the way a meadow of bees murmurs when the wind has changed. Men love to witness a humiliation that absolves them of their own small shames. The queen turned her head very slightly, the signal both practiced and sincere. The High Septon opened his mouth to declare the gods moved by such piety. Joffrey smiled. It was small, the thing Joffrey did. It was a boy's trick, a boy with a beetle and a magnifying glass discovering the sun's appetite. He turned to the crowd to be seen. He lifted his hand, palm down, because he thought that looked like command. He said in a clear, ringing voice that had been praised as beautiful by women who had believed they were being kind, "My mother bids that I grant mercy, but traitors are not allowed to live. They are dangerous. They infect the realm." He pointed with that hand and chose a word he loved.
Serilin.
"Bring me his head." The square went still.
Sie längse Tore.
For a heartbeat, Sansa heard nothing in the world but the sound of her own blood seizing. Then the bells seemed to falter mid-peal. Men shouted or did not. The queen moved one step and stopped as if her feet had been nailed. The High Septon made a huff that might have been a prayer or a cough. Ser Island, who had never looked at any person as if they were a person, moved with the slow exactness of a machine. The sword he carried remembered the grip of a Stark once. That irony would have pleased a smaller god. "No," Sansa said. "In some tellings of the world that word does a thing. It did no thing here." She tried to move toward her father, and the hound's hand closed on her upper arm like the hand of a man who had seen 1,000 throats opened and did not intend to add a little girl's spine to his memories. "Please," she said, and that word is a key for some locks, but this was not a door. She turned to the boy she had been told to love and saw that his eyes glittered with terror made into anger, the alchemy of bad mothers and afraid sons. "Joffrey," she said in the smallest voice she had, because she had learned that sometimes small things squeeze through spaces large things cannot. "Please, if you love me." He looked at her with the expression of a child who has just discovered he is not a child. "That is why, my lady wife," he said, and the word wife sat in his mouth like something he had not chewed. "I must be strong." He lifted his chin like a carved prince on a chessboard. Ser Island did his work. Ned Stark knelt as a way of holding himself together for one last moment. He thought, perhaps, of a winter day that had smelled like pine sap and his brother's shout. He thought, perhaps, of a woman with red hair who had walked into his life and filled the rooms with different kinds of light. He thought of his children because men always do. The blade went up and down and made the small sound a neck makes when parted. Sansa made no sound at all. She felt the hound's grip become an anchor, and perhaps it saved her head hitting stone when her knees decided not to be legs. The world went white around the edges and then returned with a grain the eye cannot ignore. She saw the sword lifted and the head held, because men in crowds love to be satisfied. She saw a bird fly from the sept's roof and turn a circle that meant nothing and everything. She saw a woman drop a loaf of bread because her fingers had forgotten what bread is. She saw the queen's face quiet itself after a flinch, a very small flinch, and then smooth like a sheet pulled over a body. She saw Joffrey's smile like a cut. The hound had her out of the square before her body remembered how to retch. He put her in a small side passage that smelled of beeswax and old flowers and did not look at her while she spilled everything her stomach had been keeping. He stood broad as a door. When she had finished, he handed her a cloth that had once been white. His voice was as rough as rope. "Get it all out," he said. "There's more to come." "I hate him," she said, but it came out as a whisper. "I hate all of them." She raised her head, threads of hair sticking to her cheek, and met his eye because she had learned to do that with men. "Not you," she said, as if that would mean anything to a man who had opted out of gentleness when he was still small enough to deserve it. He made a sound that could not be named and escorted her where the queen wished her kept. He did not look at the blood on his boot until he had left her, and then he sat and took the boot off and wiped it with such care it could have been a relic. When the bells finally stuttered to silence, King's Landing felt as if it had been scraped raw. Men laughed loudly in wine shops and woke in the night with their mouths open. Women held their children tighter and spoke the names of saints as if they were ordering something in a market. The small folks' rumor, an organism with its own appetite, grew thick, sprouted a dozen legs, and pattered down the alleys knocking things over. The king had killed the hand, the queen had saved him, the hand had tried to kill the king, the wolf girl had stabbed 3 guards and flown, the older girl had fainted and then spat in the queen's face, the dwarf had told a joke and run, a man in gold had smiled, a man in black had wept. You could not buy fish for a fair price the next morning. Bread ran out early. Sansa did not eat. Septa Mordain tried. The queen's woman tried. The queen did not. She sent for Sansa on the second day and regarded the girl as if she were a tapestry freshly hung. "You will yet be queen," Cersei said, bored and cold. "There is nothing in you for which I cannot find a use. You may weep at night. You will not weep where anyone can see you." She tapped her nail against the table. "When you stand beside my son, you will be as perfect as a column in the September." "I will be what you tell me to be," Sansa said, and some new creature inside her smiled at the lie of it. It was not the smile of a little girl. It held teeth. "I will also be myself when you are not in the room." Cersei's eyes narrowed a hair, admiration and irritation both. "Do not imagine you can make me like you," she said. "We are beyond such comforts." "I am not trying to make you like me," Sansa said softly. "I am trying to live." She curtsied very perfectly and left before the queen could teach her a new lesson. Arya rode in the back of a cart that smelled of onions and men and fear disguised as jokes. She slept by day and learned faces by night. Yoren taught her to piss like a boy and spit like a man and cut her hair shorter until she could feel her scalp in a different way. She learned the names of 2 other boys, Hot Pie, who had a laugh that tried to be brave and a temper that was both, and Gendry, who did not know what he was and bore it well, and Lamy with his lingering cough and the bravado that sons of poor mothers learn in place of grace. She learned that a bruise on the forearm looks different when it's a boy's. She did not let herself cry. She rolled the name of the stable boy in her head until it would not speak, and then she rolled it some more. She slept with Needle under her shirt and dreamed sometimes of Sirio's stick making the sound it had made on the Kingsguard's helm, and sometimes of the first dead boy, and sometimes of Lady's fur, and often of her father's voice telling her to seize her own feet. The King's Road was not kind. It rarely is. There were places where small men with big knives had decided to be lords and had the courage to stand in the middle of the road and declare attacks, and places where hunger had turned men's eyes into knives and women's mouths into empty pockets, and places where the Night's Watch recruits grew quiet because they had never seen so many possibilities to run. Yoren was good at discouraging possibilities. He swung an arm like a branch in a wind that did not forgive men for standing too close. Tyrion Lannister reached the crossroads in some days after a story about it had ceased being interesting. He went in because he was hungry and because he liked the way the rafters looked like ship's ribs. He drank in moderation because he had learned to dose the world carefully if he wished. Diet to stay entertaining. He exchanged rudeness with a woman who had made that an art. He did not meet Catelyn Stark and did not have a knife put to his elbow and did not find himself climbing a goat path to a sky cell and did not find himself tested on his ability to get around being thrown out of one. He went on, to the Riverlands where his father had sent him with impatience and fondness in about equal measures. He found a camp being set like a theater in a wide field and a father who looked at his son as if a card had turned over that made the hand more complicated and more fun. "We move the moment the boy from the north chooses a road," Tywin told him, with the pleasure of a man who enjoyed an opponent. "He cannot come through the mountains. He cannot march his host through the swamp. He will have to come by the river and the bridge. We will coax him where we want him by making the choice clear. And if he consternates us by choosing a better choice?" Tyrion asked, chewing bread that had known better days. "Then he is not his father's son," Tywin said, and the disdain in his voice held a surprising respect for the man he disliked. "He will come where the river names him. Your sister sends letters and thinks she has made a peace with a girl. She thinks I will stay my hand because her son wears a crown. I will teach the river lords that one does not take a loan from a Lannister without repaying it with interest." "Always the banker," Tyrion said, affection not quite hidden. He looked at the map his father leaned over and at the small markers men used to represent other men's lives. He thought, unwillingly, of a boy black-haired and blue-eyed in a forge who had a parentage that would knock these little carved stags down like pebbles if one were to blow on them. He thought of telling his father, and he did not. He drank, and the bread grew less bad. Catelyn and Robb came to the twins when they had become a puzzle and found them as they always are. 2 ungainly piles of opportunity straddling a river, and a man who had found a way to turn a petty pride into a toll. Lord Walder had never looked like a lord. He looked like a man who had obtained the right to be contemptuous and would not forget to practice. Catelyn was obliged to sit in a chair that had been made ugly on purpose and name her father's house and accept that she would have to pay more than money to persuade an old man to let armies cross his bridges. She traded youth for passage and sons for promises and swallowed everything that would have made the bargain taste worse. Robb listened to the price. He paid it with a still face. "We will talk later," he said to his mother with his eyes, and she heard, and later would come and would not find enough room for all the words. Grey Wind did not like the twins. He paced and growled low in his chest and snapped once at a child who had pulled his tail because northern wolves do not like to be the subject of jokes. The child cried, and a woman cuffed him, And Walder Frey leered because lords who know they are not admired learn to enjoy discomfort where they can find it. The bridges were lowered, not very quickly. Robb's army went over them and sent the river's spray into the air like laughter that had not learned yet where to sit. On the far bank, the men made a sound armies make when they have passed not just a body of water but a test. Robb let himself breathe and then set the maps down and placed his finger where scouts had said Lannister men had been seen. "Father," he said under his breath, and it was both a prayer and a command. In the September, where the stone had cooled finally from so much crowd pressed against it, a novice found a ribbon that had fallen under a pew. She picked it up and tucked it into her sleeve and did not tell anyone. She liked the feel of it. In the Red Keep, Joffrey ordered a head placed on the wall where he would see it on clear days and ordered traitors' children to be brought to him and told twice that one of them had gone missing and the other was his wife, and he frowned because both pieces of information complicated his desire to be obeyed. Cersei adjusted the collar of his doublet with hands that had once created more solid things than shapes of silk and told him stories about kings who killed and were called strong and kings who forgave and were called weak. She did not tell him about kings who learned to be gracious because she had not met one who had learned that and lived. The Hound did not sleep long. He started awake at sounds other men slept through and slept only when men made enough noise that he could be sure nothing noteworthy would happen. He found himself thinking of a girl in blue who had not screamed when screams would have been forgiven. He found himself more than once between that girl and the edge of a stairway or the corner of a table, a ridiculous place for a sworn sword to operate, and he cursed himself quiet. He did not drink more than usual. He found that he could not bear a certain kind of laughter, the kind that starts in a mouth and arrives at the eyes as a sneer. He avoided it. He found excuses to be in the yard where the kennel master took the bitches to whelp and the pups dreamed. Sansa learned the new rules quickly because the price of forgetting was bruises on someone else. She learned the lady's trick of never being in the way while being present enough to be counted. She learned which servants would turn their faces when she took an extra heel of bread and which would not. She learned that the best time to ask a question of the queen was just after the queen had humiliated a lord in public. Victory makes some women generous. She learned to say nothing in 6 different ways. She learned to keep her hands from rubbing the place on her wrist where lady's fur had been on the last day of her being a child. She sat sometimes at a window that did not face the sea and counted steps down to the yard, and then steps up from the yard, and ordered them into a rhythm and made herself breathe with that and not with the pulse that would have harried her into a corner. Once, she was brought before the king with a basket of fruit to hold because the queen had seen a picture of a queen holding fruit and had decided that would steady a room. She held the basket and stood near a table where men had found a new way to argue about the same old things, and she heard Littlefinger say something that sounded clever about debt and dignity, and she saw Varys smile like a man who had gotten the joke before it was told, and she watched Pycelle doze with his eyes open. Joffrey reached for a pear and missed, and his face twisted for a second with a boy's fury at his own clumsiness. And Sansa had the mad thought that if he had been allowed to fail at smaller things earlier, he might not be so determined to succeed at cruelty now. The thought went away. The basket grew heavier. She shifted it without allowing the fruit to tumble. The Hound's eye acknowledged the trick and then returned to the door. Far north, the wall grew higher, as it always does when men feel small beneath it. Jon learned to swing a sword not at a straw-stuffed man but at a breathing one, and to pull the blow when necessary and not at all when necessary in the other direction. He learned which brothers could be trusted and which should be watched and which were both. He learned from a man named Donal Noy that you can forge boys into men and you can also beat them into iron filings. He learned from Samwell Tarly that fear is a companion that does not have to lead. He learned from the old stories told by Old Nan's cousins, men whose sight had been changed by too many winters, that there were things out there in the snow that did not care how neatly a man had sworn his oaths. He stood on the top of the world and felt, for one blessed instant, the noise of the South drop out of his head. He allowed himself 1 minute of imagining that Sansa had died. He cried and hated himself for it and was grateful to Ghost for pretending not to see. The realm rearranged itself along fault lines that had always been there, the way a table cracks where the wood was weakest once it has held too much weight. Letters flew like tired birds. Men who had never held a sword ordered the deaths of men who had never held a pen. The small folk learned new ways to be hungry. The harvest came in with less joy than most years. The ocean did not change. Sansa stood on a balcony under a sky less generous with stars than the one she had grown up under. The city hummed. The queen had retired. The king had found mischief. The hound stood, an angle in the corner of her eye. She put her hands on the stone and felt the old work of other hands in it, the smoothing, the oil of 1,000 palms. She thought of her father's last look. She thought of the way Joffrey had shaped the word mercy as if it were a toy he wished to see break. She thought of Arya and tried to imagine urban alleys and the smell of onions clinging to hair. She thought of Robb and wondered whether his jaw set the way their fathers had and if he remembered to sleep. She thought of her mother and pictured her sitting on a stone bench somewhere where the sound of water could be heard, and she did not let herself imagine the shape of her mother's mouth in that moment. She knew it would unmake something. "You'll learn to sing different songs," the hound said suddenly, as if he were resuming a conversation they had never had. "Maybe you'll sing them so well that you'll forget the old ones. Maybe not." He scratched his forearm. The scar there was old, like all his scars. "Keep something for yourself, even if it's ugly." "I keep a ribbon," she said, surprising herself. "One little piece of blue. It is almost nothing." "Better than nothing," he said. He glanced at her and away. "Don't let them see it." "They see everything," she said. "They do not," he said with conviction that belonged to a different man. "Not the things that matter if you hide them in the right place." He snorted, then self-mocking. "What do I know? I spend my days keeping a boy from falling off chairs he wasn't meant to sit in." She smiled despite herself, felt rusty and then less so. "You know I am married to him," she said, because the fact seemed to rub like a twig in her shoe. "I know," he said. "I also know you could choose which kind of wife you are. There are kinds. Choose the one that will get the most men you care about through this winter." "Winter?" she asked, because it had been a long time since anyone had said it as it had been meant all her life. He looked out at the city. "It comes," he said. "Even here. Comes and it changes the way men smell. And it makes cowards and heroes, and it makes flames look different." He shifted his weight. "You'll see." She stood with him without speaking. The night had grown a little colder, as if the north had reached a long finger down and reminded her that it had not forgotten her name. She put one hand to her throat and felt her pulse. It was steadier than it had been the day before. Deep in the castle, Littlefinger chuckled at a jest Varys had not told. "The game never changes," he told himself, which is the sort of lie men like him find useful. In a tower with a single long window, Pycelle wrote a letter to a maester in Old Town asking for more sleep on account of age. He had never learned to be ashamed of the wrong things. In a room made of weather and stubbornness on Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon read and reread a line in a book that should have belonged to someone else and came to a decision as slow and heavy as a tide. He would write letters. He would name names. He would light no torches and would rely on truth to be its own fire. Davos Seaworth, learning this, rubbed his hands as if against the cold of what it would cost. "Truth burns slow," he said, and Stannis stared at him because he did not like metaphors unless they offered a path he could march on. On the King's Road, Arya woke with a blade in her hand and her hair in her eyes and a boy snoring with his mouth open 2 feet away and a smell of wet canvas and piss and horse and smoke. And for a second she did not know her own name. She knew only the word "not today," and it kept her warm. By the Riverlands, Catelyn stood beneath a willow that murmured like a woman working with her mouth closed and watched her son deploy men with a knack that looked too modern for his age. "You will need help you will not like accepting," she told him. "You will need to be admired by men who are not admirable. You will need not to be sentimental about maps. You will need to be sentimental about your men." Robb nodded and made a note on a parchment and then burned it because his mother had taught him that paper is the second thing men sees. He went to bed that night and lay long awake. Gray wind slept, feet twitching, and Robb wondered whether wolves dream of running toward or away. He closed his eyes and dreamed of a stone head on a wall, and he woke and did not cry because he had learned the trick of taking the tears and placing them into a small box he would not open until it was safe. He did not wonder when safe would be. He doubted safe existed. He got up, dressed, and went to speak to the men who would ride out at dawn to find the fords. He did not tell them to be brave. He told them how long he expected them to be gone so their wives would know when to begin to worry. The realm bent, which is what realms do when too much has been placed on them. A girl held a ribbon. A boy held a sword. A mother held a map. A father held a memory. A dog held a posture between a woman and a stone. The sea held the light the same way it always had. The sky held nothing and looked like everything. Sansa slept and did not dream. The morning would come with its exacting chores, curtsies, measured smiles, a mouth that knew when to say please and when to withhold it like coin, a steady back beside a throne. A new thing had begun inside her, and it would take time to learn its size. She turned once, seeking a weight that was not there, and the absence did not bite as sharply as it had bitten the night before. Her hand found the ribbon where she had hidden it in the mattress seam and pressed it into her palm until the threads imprinted the skin. It hurt, felt honest. She let her breath go and pulled it again and listened to the city and to the sea and to a future approaching with a step that was not yet familiar but would be. The morning after the bells fell silent. The Red Keep wore its quiet like a bruise. Servants walked as if the stones could crack under too firm a footfall. Men with swords found themselves listening more than looking, all the doors grown louder in their hinges. Word had already outrun the day. It always did. But there was a difference between hearing that a thing had been done and living in the place where it had been done. The city tried to pretend at hunger for its markets and thirst for its taverns. Sansa understood pretending now with a precision that had cost her. They brought her to the battlements because Joffrey liked to measure what obedience would do to a person. He had slept, or claimed he had, and the skin under his eyes had learned a purple that did not agree with his hair. He took her hand as if a hand were a leash and led her to the place where the heads had been set in a neat, instructive row. The wind was not strong, and still it lifted some hair from a cheek, made a jaw change its angle, pressed a mouth into a different grimace. He ordered her to look. "This is what kingship costs," he said, half to her and half to himself, and made a gesture that indicated each point on the uneven skyline as if he were naming saints. "That one was seditious," he said, "and that one, and that one." She could not find her father. The problem was simple. The faces were wrong. Death makes every face a cousin. She tried to count the places where the beard had been trimmed more carefully than the others. She tried to find the cut in the ear she remembered from a winter night by the hearth when she had asked what had happened to it, and he had told her a story about a summer when he had been a boy. The wind shifted. A raven landed and considered the offerings with an air of professional interest. Her lips moved and then she stopped them moving. If she started to count aloud, if she began to say anything, she feared she would not stop. "Do you see, my lady wife?" Joffrey asked. He was at once proud of the question and of his ability to ask it in a tone that suggested kindness. She breathed in and did not breathe out on command. "I see that you are king," she said, because that was the safest of the many true things present. He leaned forward, a boy on a parapet with a cruel idea. "Perhaps we should put yours up beside them if your brother does not come to his senses," he said lightly, as boys say terrible things in a game to see if anyone will flinch. "Then he can see what defiance brings a wolf." The hound was near. He was always near when Joffrey went looking for a performance. Sandor's mouth twitched, the barest suggestion that a lip had remembered it could be useful for purposes besides holding in teeth. "Enough," he said, not loudly. He put a hand on Sansa's arm and moved her one pace back from the Merlin, as if he had seen attackers where there were only gulls. "Your Grace," he said, giving the title a shape that might pass for respect if the hall were loud enough. "You don't want to spoil your view with ugly work." Joffrey glanced at him, anger and a kind of gratitude fighting under his thin skin. He liked being checked by this man more than he would ever have admitted. It made him feel like danger was something he could hold on a leash. "You forget your place," he said stiffly, because that sentence came easily to him. He let Sansa go with a little push that would have been accident in another boy. "Mind you do not fall," he added. like a joke a young man tells to prove to himself he isn't worried. Sansa stepped away from the heads until the wind became merely wind again. She stood where the stones remembered other people's feet and tried again to find breath. The hound's hand stayed where it had been, not tight, not loose, a weight that did not ask anything of her. "Do not look," he said, which would have been good advice earlier and was still good advice after. "Only fools look at what they cannot change and expect to be stronger for it." She made herself nod once. "He will make me come here again," she said, finding the shape of Joffrey as a problem. "He will make me pretend I am grateful for what I am shown." "Then pretend better," Sandor said. He took his hand back, as if remembering that he had no right to how calm her arm felt under his palm. "Save your anger for when it bites." Her anger did not feel like teeth yet. It felt like a warm stone she carried from room to room. She went back to the small chamber where the Septa sat straight-backed with prayer like a shawl around her shoulders. Sansa lay on the bed and put her hand to the seam where she had hidden the ribbon and pressed it against her palm until the pain made a clean line. In the Riverlands, pain drew a different line. Robb held his counsel under a sky that had scabbed over with clouds and listened to Glover and Tallheart and the Great John pull a battlefield out of air, the way men who have done it before can. Catelyn sat with the map under her hands and weighed the Lannister way of war. Swiftness, wealth for supply, scorn for sentiment, against the river's truth that land and water have their own loyalties. Scouts came and went like thoughts and left scraps of certainty. Tywin Lannister was in the field with a great host and a confy. Denke that came from never once imagining that fortune could be something he did not deserve. Jaime Lannister rode at the head of a different host, arrogant as a man who has never spent a night without believing himself the prettiest thing under the moon. "He will come for Riverrun," Robb said, saying it made his teeth ache less. "If we do not make him pay before he puts his tent up under my grandfather's walls, the price will be the wrong one." Catelyn's mouth tightened at the word grandfather and relaxed because the word was also true. "We split," she said, as if the decision had been hers all along and her son's statement only a courtesy. "You take the stronger part to meet the Kingslayer. Roose Bolton will march east and show Lord Tywin that the North can stand in his road. He will make him believe you have committed your strength. He will make him believe the wrong thing." Bolton's eyes did not tell his thoughts, but his voice did what it always did, which was to agree in a way that left the impression he had decided. "As my lady says," he murmured. "Choose your men for the Whispering Wood," Catelyn added to Robb when the council broke. She regretted the phrase the moment it left her. It made the thing sound like a song, and there would be nothing in it to sing. "Choose men who know quiet. Choose men who can wait with their breath." Robb did. He chose men who had learned patience in winter and men who did not sneeze at dust and men who could find their way by scent. Grey Wind went with them, not because wolves obey orders but because the wind was right. Catelyn leaned into a tree and closed her eyes while they trod out into the night. She had not slept properly in days. Sleep felt like a trick she had remembered too late. She pressed her hand to her ribs as if pain could be coaxed into moving to a different house. They lay in the dark with leather wrapped in cloth to keep their gear from talking, with horses that had been stroked into silence, with mouths that had learned to breathe slowly. Jaime came when he was meant to, as if he had sent a letter announcing his route. He came with his standard and his laugh and his casual control of the men whose fathers had told them they would be safe beside him. He came with the smell of expensive oil clinging to his hair and with the sound of Saunders' fellows who wanted to be the ones to please him. The traps closed. The woods learned a new grammar, the punctuation of a horse stumbling, of a man's yelp cut clean, of a muffled order, of a wolf's throat making the sound that curdles a careful man's blood. Grey Wind went in and came out with red on his jaw and a look like an old god after a well-kept sacrifice. They pulled Jaime from his saddle like a boy dragged from a stolen apple tree. He fought like a man who had never been taught to lose and found the lesson offensive. He killed 2 men and then 3 more with motions that were too elegant for the work being done. When they had him, when the ropes remembered their craft and bit his wrists, he grinned through the blood on his teeth. "Which of you is the boy?" he asked into the dark. I can't see in the pretty forest you've made. Robb came forward, not so close the captive could spit at him. He was younger than the voice had expected. I am Robb Stark, he said, and did not say Lord because the word felt wrong in a wood. Of course you are, Jaime said. It is always the boy. Did you enjoy it? The men you killed had names, Robb said, which was not an answer, and yet it was. They don't, Jaime said, smiling wider, because being cruel felt like clinging to the ledge. Not to me. They took him back through the dark like a prize that had its own eyes. The men around Robb wanted to shout. They did not, because the boy who had become their lord had asked them not to. When they reached the road with the dawn beginning to test whether it could get through the trees, Catelyn stepped out. She looked at Jaime Lannister as if weighing him in a hand and finding him perhaps a little lighter than the stories. Sire, she said. My lady. He replied with perfect politeness and a glance that suggested he would have flirted if his wrists had not been pinioned and his lips split. You have a handsome boy. I have a captured one, Catelyn said. You have my father's sword still in your scabbard, so do not speak to me of handsome. Later, in Riverrun's great hall, Robb stood very straight while the river lords cried their griefs and rage into the rafters. The great Jon bellowed and slapped his palm on the table. Lord Karstark stared at Jaime as if he could set him on fire by staring. Men spoke of marching to King's Landing and of burning Harrenhal as if fire could teach old stone a lesson. Catelyn kept her eyes on her son and his on her. He was waiting for the word she would not give him because it belonged to them, not to her. It came from the back where a voice had not been the loudest until it had decided to be. The king in the north! The great Jon roared, and the room's temperature changed. Men turned toward Robb as if a magnet had been placed under the floorboards. They picked up the word king and put it on the boy's shoulders as if they could see how it would fit by pretending it already did. They came forward one by one and knelt and held up swords that had killed their father's enemies and promised to kill their sons. Catelyn watched, and her mouth did something that was not a smile and not a grimace and not quite a gasp. She had feared it and she had sought it. It did not care. It was happening. Robb's jaw did not shake. He bowed his head and allowed the weight to settle. I am yours, he told them. It was not true. He was his and she was hers, and each man in that room was someone's son first. It was good he lied. Kings must. In the Lannister camp, the news arrived with a speed only fear can teach to a messenger. Tywin Lannister read it and said nothing for the space a candle takes to gutter and right itself. Then he placed a coin on the map where Robb Stark's camp sat, and he did it with a fingertip that made the coin ring. Send word to Ser Kevin, he said. He is to hold as I instructed. We are not pulled away by a boy crowning himself in a catfish's hall. He has made himself easier to name, nothing more. Tyrion watched his father's cheek while he spoke. He found himself imagining, with a reckless intimacy unusual to him where his father was involved, what the cheek would look like slackened with age and surprise. It did not slacken. It had been sculpted at birth to hold exactly this expression. He has the Kingslayer, Tyrion said, because someone had to say the thing that should not be ignored. My son, Tywin corrected him, in the tone of a man who would not be corrected in the important ways. To be bargained for. He looked at Tyrion at last. You will go to King's Landing. You will correct your sister. You will be my hand where she fails. She has allowed the mob to taste blood and not been quick enough to teach them to fear it. Take Bronn. Take men who remember how to follow orders when the room is full of women. Take care what you say to the boy. Tyrion bowed like a jester made to serve a strict god. And if the boy does not like me, then make him not liking you pay him, Tywin said, not unkindly. And bring me back the city without having to pick it out of the sea. He met Shay that night because men who are sent to a task they do not relish have always paid for another sort of labor to teach themselves that pleasure still exists. She was clever and false and dangerous, which are three of the same thing in a certain light. He told himself he could keep her out of the parts that mattered. He told himself many things. He drunk less than he might have. He laughed more than he usually would have because laughter shames fear in a private room. In the morning, He had brawn at his elbow and a small company with more gristle than heraldry, and he turned his pony's head toward the capital. On the wall, Jon Snow learned that news arrives where men think it cannot go. It came with a black raven croak and the tilt of a steward's mouth that had forgotten how to smile. It came with a letter read in a room that smelled of onions and oil and old men's blankets. PYP's hands shook. Gren's mouth opened and did not close. Sam wept without noise, tears falling straight down like stones. Jon stood very still over the piece of paper and saw words he already knew before they were read aloud. He left the room because he could not stand the sound of lips making shapes around the name of his father and the word that followed it. He saddled a horse without knowing which, and Ghost whined once and then quieted. He put his foot in the stirrup and did not swing up because Sam's hands were on the leather and because 3 other hands were on his arm and his thigh and his anger and because the wall does not let men go without a tug. "Where will you ride?" PYP asked, desperate humor clinging to his teeth. "Do you remember the way? It is all south." "I remember the way to my family," Jon said, hoarse. "You remember your oath," Sam whispered. His nose was red and he had never looked less like a knight. "You told it in front of a heart tree that other men think is only a tree." It heard. "It did not save him," Jon said. He hated the words as soon as he said them. "It did not do anything." "It saved you," Sam said, with a fearlessness that comes only to those who have nothing else to hold. "It gave you someplace to be when you heard this. It gave you brothers to stop you doing a thing that will break you." Jon looked at him until the room steadied. He let them pull him away from the horse and back into a bed and into dawn without the south. He did not forgive himself for staying. He let days pass like that. Bread, ice, breath, words. And in the night a creature with blue hands clawed at Jeor Mormont's blankets and bent over the old man as if to kiss him. Jon woke to Ghost's teeth in the thing's arm and the smell of singed hair in his nose and found the thing would not die properly until he took fire to it. The Lord Commander gave him Longclaw and the words that men give boys when they wish to make them strong enough to carry a new weight. "You may think you should have gone," Mormont said later, in a voice that had known 1,000 dawns. "You will be tempted by that thought often. You will learn to put it away as you would a dull knife." Jon held the sword under the sky and thought of his father's head and Sam's small voice and the way the wall's shadow lengthened when the sun walked away and felt something in him decide not to break. He did not feel better. He felt shaped. On the King's Road, Yoren's party stopped at a holdfast with a cracked well and a wall that had been mended with a hopeful hand. The woman who had inherited it fed them onions and thin soup and asked no names, which was a kindness. Night fell with an efficiency that surprised Arya. She woke to the sound of men asking for a boy. Gold cloaks stood in the yard with the expressions of men who like what happens when a poor man is made to be sorry. They wanted Gendry because someone had remembered to follow up a rumor, and because the queen had decided that her husband's bastards were weeds that spoiled her garden. Yoren stood and did not move aside. He had one hand on the door and one on his knife, and his small gray eyes were not impressed. "Take yourself back to your city," he said. "I have sworn men and boys both. If the queen wants a boy whose mother is not the queen, she can come herself and ask for him polite." "By the king's order," the captain said, and the words had the force of a man who had fallen asleep before that paper had been torn. "Stand aside." Yoren spat and missed on purpose so the man could decide to be insulted or not. "You're late for the last king's orders," he said. "Early for the next. Come morning we'll be gone. Find your boy in the tracks if you can tell which is which." The gold cloaks were not brave enough to haul him aside. They left. The next day there were different men, not moth-eaten city watch but Lannister soldiers under a banner that had forgotten how to feel shame about being a lion. They did not ask. They fired the thatch and drove at the gate with a ladder they had carved from a tree they did not own. Yoren died in the doorway, where a good man dies when he refuses to recount his oaths to men who will not understand them. Arya saw the top of his head for a moment as he fell and then saw only feet. She took Needle and Hot Pie's hand and shouted at Gendry to run and did, and the holdfast became a puzzle of smoke and screaming. Lami fell and cried about his leg until there was no breath left to shape and then there was no Lami. Arya found a hole where a dog had once huddled and pushed through it and pulled another boy after her and ran until the fields stopped being fields and turned into a blur. They were caught later because men with horses can catch children with legs. They were taken to Harrenhal, miracle of a ruin, Lady Tower of every punishment, where iron had melted once and would have melted again if fire could be ashamed. Arya learned a new set of names and found that some of them took strangers' weight better than others when whispered at night. She learned Whisa's voice and his kick, and Chella's bracelets of ears, and the smell of blood baked into old stone. She learned that if you hold a bowl of soup with a steady hand, men think you cannot hold a knife. She learned Jaqen Hagar's voice. That was for later. For now it was enough to breathe. Tyrion reached King's Landing with Bronn at his shoulder and a set of instructions that tasted of iron. The city had become 10 degrees more drunk and 20 more frightened since he had last walked its streets. He went to the small council chamber with dust on his boots and words in his pocket. Cersei looked at him and smiled. It was a tired smile. It had been polished by nights like the one that came with bells. "Father sends you to babysit," she said. "How dutiful." "He sends me to make your boy less dangerous to himself," Tyrion said pleasantly. "And to you. And to me. Come to it." Pycelle dozed and snorted when he meant to give sage advice. Varys smiled and placed a hand on the back of a chair, as if to see whether it would break under pressure. Littlefinger counted the sequence of his fingers' taps and found it pleased him. Tyrion took the chair and informed them that Janos Slynt would be removed from the city watch and that Ser Jacelyn Bywater would take his place. That the hill tribes who had not been with him, and whom he had not persuaded over a mountain road this time, would be replaced by Sellswords with better habits and less pride. That the Queen's men would share their letters more quickly and their wine less expensively. That the boy would be denied the pleasure of killing singers for 2 weeks. He said it in a tone that made it a joke and a decree. Sansa watched him the first time he came into the Queen's solar and did not bow too low. She had learned a Lannister face by now, and this was not one of Cersei's. He was amused and tired and exact. He looked at her as if to say that he saw the shape of her cage and would never smash it, not because he did not want to, but because he had learned that men who smash cages always cut their hands and leave the bird inside dead. He watched the line of her mouth when the Queen spoke about mercy. He asked later, sent through the hound, whether she needed oranges or onions or anything sensible. She sent back that she wanted to see the godswood. He replied that there was no godswood. He sent her a sprig of rosemary anyway. She hid it with the ribbon and tried not to think of its scent when the Queen's woman brushed her hair with oil that smelled of something expensive. Stannis Baratheon sent letters. He named the Queen's children what no man had dared name them. He made facts sound like punishment. The letters arrived everywhere they could, and in many places they did not. Some were read aloud and laughed at. Some were put away and would be remembered later and injure men. Some were burned by septons who believed the truth a contagion. Cersei laughed where she was obliged to laugh and then stopped laughing and reordered her guards and sent a man to count candles in the king's rooms at night. Renly married a girl with hair like summer and banners like gardens. The Reach spread its soft green over his tents and disguised the weight of so much steel. Songs sprouted like mushrooms after rain. The realm learned to say the word king in 3 different keys. In the Red Keep, Joffrey performed kingship with the ardor of a boy who loves his own reflection and hates the mouth that told him he was handsome. He made a lady kneel to ask for the return of her husband's head and then refused it. He made a knight eat mud because a small folk girl had thrown it and he had been in the way. He made Sansa tell him she loved him in a voice that could have woken the most stubborn of the 7 if they had ears to be woken. Tyrion watched, made a small face, and began moving men around like cups ready for a street game. He spoke to the hound in a corner after the king had thrown a goblet and missed Sansa's face because he had not learned to aim from that distance. "Do you intend to let him break all his toys?" Tyrion asked. "I intend to keep him in the chair long enough that he doesn't die on it," Sandor said. "Beyond that I intend nothing. Don't ask me to intend more." "And the girl?" Tyrion's voice was mild. "The girl intends to live," Sandor said. "She'll need better luck than this to manage it." He glanced down the corridor where Sansa had gone away with her shoulders straighter than they should have been. She's learned to walk like a blade kept in linen. I've seen men cut themselves on that. Tyrion rubbed the bridge of his nose. I will try to make fewer things to cut. On a blazing noon, Joffrey had Sansa dragged into the yard because rumor moves faster than sense and he wanted to feel large. He had her stripped of her outer gown so that the city could measure the thinness of a northern girl away from her winter. He had Ser Meryn hit her with the flat of his sword and then the back of his hand until the sound satisfied some itch. The hound stood too far away to stop it. Tyrion arrived not with a sword but with the ability to be ashamed better than the others, and with the authority of his father's paper, and with the habit of speaking as if humor were a blade. I will speak to the king, he said, and walked into the circle of men as if it were a parlor. Your grace, it is poor sport to strike a girl. She has no weapon. She has her tongue, Joffrey said. His own had the shape of wine and petulance. Many girls do, Tyrion said agreeably. They use them and the realm survives. He did not glance at Sansa, refusing to turn her into the center of this. He refused to let Joffrey feel the heat of her humiliation as another spice to taste. If she is to be punished, let it be by queens and septas and needlework. Leave the rest to men who like women too little to be allowed to hit them. It was a better joke than it seemed. The hound moved. Not much. Just enough to stand 2 paces closer to Sansa as the king hesitated and bristled and gave way. Afterward, when she was returned to her room with bruises that would bloom like a poisonous garden, the hound came and stood at the door and did not enter. You had better learn to sing without a voice, he said through the wood. Save your breath for when there is someone to listen. Is there ever? She asked, surprising herself with the bitterness. Sometimes, he said, and sometimes you sing for yourself. She lay with her face turned to the wall and remembered the sound of wind in Winterfell's pines. She allowed one tear as if she were making a donation to a god she did not wholly believe in. Then she slept because sleep remains a stubborn friend when all others grow unreliable. Robb marched. He did not let his men cheer too often. He let them eat when food presented itself and share when it did not. Jaime sat in a cell in Riverrun with his wrists healed and a tongue that did not tire. Catelyn visited him with a pitcher of water and a face that had learned to be colder than courtesy required. He tried to make her angry. It would have been something to do. She allowed him nothing. My daughters, she said. My father. My house. He shrugged. The day would come when he would matter again. He believed this the way he believed he was beautiful. Catelyn sat with Hoster and fed him broth between breaths that sounded like a river forgetting how to run. She wrote letters that asked for kindness and the return of a girl who had no coin with which to purchase it. She prayed to gods that did not live in stone. She slept with her cheek on the table like a woman returned from a ball to discover the dance had not been for her. She dreamed of a man with ice in his hands rising to stand where he had fallen and opening his mouth to say a thing she could not hear. She woke and did not tell anyone. At Dragonstone, a red woman stood with Stannis in a niche where the wind made the torches shy. Davos disliked her the way a sensible man dislikes a tool he cannot prove is broken. Stannis asked him whether he believed in signs. I believe in ships that float and men who do not lie when they must not, Davos said, as careful as a sailor entering a harbor he had never seen. If the Lord of Light is the God that burns, I will not stand too close to his altar. Stannis accepted the answer because there were many other men willing to stand too close. He sent more letters because truth is a comfort to men who have decided to bear the cost of it. He sent men to gather ships because he had learned to trust the sea more than other things. He lit a fire and stood before it and did not pretend to pray. The woman said words and made a face that could be called ecstasy or mimicry. He watched her and saw a tool he wished to use to fix a thing that should never have been broken. He grieved for a minute privately that it should be so. Then he dismissed the grief as another indulgence. Winter pried its first knuckle into the south. It did not bring snow yet. It brought a cold wind that spoke with an accent the capital had not heard for years. Sansa lifted her head when it entered her small room. She stood at the window and the air touched her throat, and she felt for one moment something that felt more like herself than anything the queen had given her to wear. She did not smile. She did not cry. She put the ribbon to her lips like a vow and pressed a sprig of rosemary to it, and the scents, home and hunger, mixed. The city below continued its business, the buying and selling of fruit and flesh and fabric and favors. Men in the Red Keep continued their business, buying and selling loyalty and information and safety. The small folk moved around a king like ants around honey that had curdled, wanting it and suspecting it and knowing it would rot their teeth. The sea pressed into its shape without asking permission. Sansa stepped away from the window and let the room put itself back on her skin. She would be called soon to stand where a queen stood and to say a sentence that would be used later as proof. She would say it. She would make the saying cost her less than it might have. She would keep a little coin aside in the form of a ribbon and a scent and a memory of wind. She would keep the way the hound had stood closer when the world offered her the edge. She would keep her father's last look, not as a wound but as a thing she could touch when the room closed up. Beyond the walls, the King's Road learned to carry armies. In the north, a boy stood under a heart tree and asked nothing and received nothing and was steadier for it. On the river, a wolf with a gray flank ran ahead of men and made their courage sound different in their throats. In the Vale, a woman stared at an empty sky and insisted there were threats there because that made the present ones more manageable. In the south, a garden was being prepared for a wedding whose petals would fall quickly. In the east, a city of bones slept under the sand and did not wake. In the far north, something that had not considered men in a very long time started to turn its face toward them again. For now, in the capital, a girl held a ribbon and stood up without making a noise and went where she was told. She counted her steps down the corridor. She counted her steps up the stairs. She counted the beats between the king's words and her own. She counted all this and did not let the counting be seen. She kept for herself one quiet thought, that the story could be told differently, even if it would not be today. She would wait. She had learned how.